Chapter 532. 7,000 Words. Chapter 489. Unexpected Candidate. Todoro's strength has been strengthened. No matter how you look at it, this is a good thing for Seiya. Even if he is used as cannon fodder, it will still be more valuable. The country bumpkin maliciously thought to himself. Then, he put on a very stern expression. Well then, Todoro, I happen to have something I need someone to do. Considering your current situation, I think you are the best person to do it. Todoro's face quickly fell. Based on his past experiences, whenever his master says something like this in such a righteous tone, it means that he is going to give him a job with a slim chance of survival. Can I refuse? Todoro carefully squeezed out a smile that was uglier than crying. No, Seiya said resolutely and decisively. The magician became discouraged and spread out his hands. Then what choice do I have? Master, just tell me, what kind of dangerous job do you want me to do? You don't want me to challenge the God Emperor Odin, do you? Seiya kicked the guy's butt. Scram. You? After a slight pause, Seiya stopped laughing and looked at Todoro. This matter is very important to me. Moreover, I must say that I need someone who is absolutely loyal to me and absolutely reliable to carry out this task. Therefore, although I have a lot of people under my command, after thinking about it, I think you are the most suitable person to be the leader. Todoro's eyes suddenly lit up. Then, ignoring the footprint on his but left by the master's kick, the magician immediately rushed forward and hugged Seiya's thigh. Oh! My master, you finally know the loyalty of this Todoro. My loyalty to you is unquestionable. Loyalty is my motto. Courage is my. I'll leave these words for you to carve on your tombstone after you die. Seiya looked at the magician, who had an irritating expression on his face. Then, what reward can I get for carrying out this important mission? The Archmage's eyes began to sparkle. Well, what reward can I get for carrying out this important mission? Seiya raised his leg and kicked again. A moment later, the magician, who had a few more footprints on his body, finally got up from the ground and protested, Master, you can't treat a high-level magician like this. You should know. Seeing that Seiya was about to draw his sword, Todoro quickly shut his mouth. I need you to make a trip to the capital for me. Seiya said solemnly. This is a very confidential matter. You are not allowed to leak this matter to anyone. Do you understand? Including everyone in the garrison, even our colleagues in the northern military region. Although Todoro's character was somewhat wretched, he was not an idiot. He immediately understood. You mean? Sir Green, it's good that you understand. Seiya's face was stiff. He could not help but look at Merlin, who was still standing in the room. Don't worry, I have no interest in these matters of yours. Merlin coldly threw out those words and turned to leave. Before he left, he said, Todoro, you better not be too arrogant outside. Be careful of exhausting your magic. If you don't come back in time to replace your blood, you will die. Those words surprised Seiya. This Merlin, when did he start to care about Todoro's life and death? In Merlin's eyes, Todoro should be nothing more than a test subject for him. After Merlin had left, Seiya cleared his throat and said in a low voice, I need you to go to the imperial capital to meet with General Adric. No, you should first meet with Roar and that fatso. For safety's sake, this matter cannot be written in black and white. So, you can only pass on my message. After saying that, Seiya told Todoro about his speculation regarding Hastings' crazy plan to launch a surprise attack on the imperial capital. Hearing that, Todoro's eyes widened and he sucked in a deep breath. God! He is too crazy. This is truly a crazy plan. Revenge and hatred will always make people crazy, Seiya muttered. Then, he stared into Todoro's eyes. Do you understand? You must personally tell this to Roar and have him bring you to meet with Adric. Before meeting with Roar or Adric, you cannot tell anyone about this. After saying that, Seiya stared at Todoro and said fiercely, If even half a word about this matter is leaked out, you are dead. Do you understand? Of course, I would never dare to tell anyone. The magician immediately swore. Then, he could not help but carefully look at Shea. If General Roer or General Adric were to accidentally leak it out, then you will still be dead. Shea stared at the magician in a rude and unreasonable manner. As expected, Todoro wailed in his heart. However, he put on a loyal expression and said, I understand. Sir, you are fair and just in the way you handle things. This lowly one is sincerely convinced. Shea finally changed to a slightly gentler tone. Patting Todoro's shoulder, he said, All right, you are a smart person. You should understand the importance of this matter to me. You cannot let anyone know about my private contact with Hastings, especially the other lords in the capital. I asked you to do this because I trust you. Besides, this matter is actually not too dangerous. It's a bit far from here to the imperial capital. Although there's chaos everywhere, you're still a magician. As long as you show your identity as a magician, I don't think any local power would dare to provoke a passing magician. Todoro thought for a moment. That was true. The magician's mood quickly improved. Moreover, he suddenly thought of another matter. The capital. Back to the capital. When I, Todoro, was in trouble in the capital, I was stripped of my identity as a magician and became the laughingstock of the magician world. Everyone said that I was trash. But now I, Todoro, have extraordinary magical strength. This time, when I return to the capital, I will let those fellows who once looked down on me take a good look. This thought quickly made Todoro's body tremble with excitement. His eyes emitted a bright light. There is no time to lose, Shea said, although according to my judgment, Hastings still has 3 months before he moves south. Who knows if he will suddenly change his mind. Therefore, it is best that you leave immediately. It is a pity that Merlin's magic carpet was destroyed. Otherwise, it would be much more convenient. Go to the backyard. I will allow you to pick 2 of the best horses in the mansion. After that, you can immediately leave for the south. Todoro did not hesitate. He did not decline and immediately walked out with large stride. The magician obeyed and ran to the groom of the garrison mansion. Without hesitation, he chose 2 of the best warhorses. Then, he took Shea's order and ran to the military supply department to withdraw a sum of money for the journey. In the end, the magician ran as fast as he could out of Denzel City and along the main road to the south. I have to leave quickly. If Merlin comes up with some terrible method to torture me, it will be terrible. As soon as he left Denzel City, the Archmage immediately felt as though he was a fish that could leap freely in the vast sea and a bird that could fly freely in the vast sky. He even very coquettishly took out a white magician's robe that he had secretly brought with him from his bag, and put it on. White robes were the robes that only high-level magicians were qualified to wear in the Empire's Magicians' Academy. Then, he openly pinned the mithril magic badge that belonged to a Grand Magus on his chest. Feeling that it wasn't eye-catching enough, he spat and fiercely wiped the badge until it shone brightly. Only then did he let out a satisfied laugh. His white robe fluttered and his horse galloped. Our great Magus, Lord Todoro, embarked on his journey south. After Todoro left, Shea began to deal with another matter. Daphne. The news of the Empress' assassination had been publicly spread. Of course, what was revealed was only the part about the assassins sent by the rebel forces from El Salvador. The assassin sent by the Emperor was naturally kept a secret. Shea was waiting. He was waiting for news from Osgilla. Sure enough, after a few days, a messenger came from the new city of Ilton County. He brought the news from Osgilla that Shea had been waiting for many days. The Byzantine Empire had set up magical teleportation portals in some of the important cities all over the country. They were used to transmit important government orders, military orders, or important news. Under Shea's rule, The new city of Ilton County was an important city in the north of the empire. It was also the former base of the 7th Division of the Empire's Central Army. Naturally, such a magical teleportation portal was set up to ensure that government orders from the Empire's Central Army could be received at any time. After Shea captured the rebel assassin, he quickly sent his subordinates to convey the news to the imperial capital using the magic portals. Because the magic portals in the imperial capital were official, once the news reached the imperial capital, it was difficult to hide and would quickly spread. Sure enough, when the news of the Empress was assassinated in Denzel City and almost died, was revealed in the imperial capital, what surprised many people was not the fact that the Empress was assassinated, but the fact that the Empress was actually in Denzel City. This news naturally caused a huge commotion. No matter what, the Empress was the Empress after all. The dignified Empress was actually staying in a small border city in the north for a long period of time. No matter how one looked at it, it was very undignified and inappropriate. This matter would undoubtedly affect the reputation of the imperial family. Sure enough, Emperor Garcia could no longer sit by and do nothing. The imperial family immediately released a statement to refute the rumors, claiming that the Empress was traveling to the north before the war. Later, due to the chaos of the war, the roads were blocked and she had no choice but to stay in the north and not return. At the same time, the announcement also implied that the Empress was carrying out an important mission for the imperial family to appease the local military forces in the north. This excuse appeared to be very dignified because everyone knew that the Empress' other identity was the daughter of the Duke of Minas. The Duke of Minas wielded a great deal of influence within the imperial family's military forces. Using this identity to appease the local military forces was indeed a good idea. However, there were still many who were clear-headed enough to see the loophole in this excuse. Going to the north before the war? What a joke! Do you think we are all fools? Before the war, the Empress was only the wife of the crown prince. At that time, the late Emperor Cantos was still on the throne. Given Emperor Cantos' style, how could he allow his daughter-in-law to go out and patrol the area? Furthermore, when Emperor Cantos was on the throne, he did not even have enough time to suppress the Minas family's influence in the military. Under all kinds of criticism, the emperor, in order to appease these unsettling discussions, issued an official order to the northern garrison general, Duke Shea Thunder, through the official transmission channel. Duke Shea Thunder was to immediately send people to escort the Empress back to the imperial capital and ensure her personal safety. At the same time, a commendation order was also sent out along with this order. Duke Shea Thunder's outstanding performance in the assassination of the Empress, successfully dispelling the treacherous actions of the assassins and protecting the Empress' personal safety. Duke Shea Thunder's contribution was commended. At the same time, Shea was bestowed with 1 or 2 court titles. For this kind of commendation that did not have any practical benefits, Shea directly used it to wipe his ass when he went to the toilet. However, the matter of escorting the Empress back to the imperial capital could not be delayed any longer. It was officially scheduled. From Shea's sphere of influence to the imperial capital Australia, there were many mountains and rivers along the way, and they had to pass through several rebel forces' spheres of influence. If they were to travel with light carriages and horses, it would definitely not work. If the rebel forces knew that the Empress was passing through the border, wouldn't they send troops to intercept and kill her? If they could capture the Empress, not only would it be a great blow to the reputation of the imperial family, but it would also be an important bargaining chip to threaten the Duke of Minas. If they wanted the Empress to return to the imperial capital, they must send troops to escort her along the way. This was not an easy task. If they sent too few, it might not be enough. Along the way, they would be surrounded by wolves. If they only sent 100 or 200 guards, it might not even be enough to fill the gaps between the wolves' teeth. But if they sent too many, sending thousands of cavalry, Shea was not that generous. He only had a few thousand cavalry under his command. If thousands of cavalry were to go to war, the military expenses and food supplies would be a big headache. The Northern Army was not that extravagant to the extent of squandering military expenses. There was also the problem of choosing the leader of the army. The leader of the army had to have enough loyalty and courage, and at the same time, they had to be careful, smart, and courageous enough. Under Shaya's command, there are many such outstanding generals. For example, General Reinhardt, who once led thousands of Rodria army's remnants from the south all the way to the north, marching thousands of miles, can be called an outstanding commander. But Shaya did not intend to let Reinhardt do such a thing. Soon, the candidates were decided. The person chosen by General Shaya made everyone in the Northern Army drop their jaws. The people chosen by Shaya were not old officials like Katua or Sharba, who had been loyal to Shaya since his debut, nor were they outstanding generals like Reinhardt, who joined later. The name of the lucky person chosen by Shaya is Stephen. He was originally a deputy flag-bearer of the 7th Corps of the Empire's Central Army. He is currently the flag-bearer of the 4th Infantry Emblem Regiment of the 2nd Garrison Corps of the Northern Garrison Military Region. The name was unfamiliar, because this person chosen by Shaya was not one of Shaya's old subordinates, nor was he an outstanding talent who joined later. This person was only a mid-level officer of the 7th Division, and his talent was very mediocre. After the 7th Division was merged by Shaya, senior officers like him either did not know how to adapt to the situation and were stripped of their military authority by Shaya, or obediently accepted Shaya's incorporation. This Mr. Stephen belonged to the latter. However, under Shaya's command, after the reorganization of the army, most of the veteran officers of the Empire's 6th and 7th Corps were transferred to the Northern Army's 2nd Corps, Garrison Corps. Those who could continue to stay in the 1st Division, which was the main division of Shaya's Northern Army, were very rare. On one hand, Shaya did not trust these veterans. He knew very well that many of them still held grudges against him for incorporating the Central Army. On the other hand, Shaya was trying his best to eliminate the traces of the Central Army in his Northern Army. Stephen was an obedient and sensible guy. At first, he didn't resist Shaya's incorporation. After obediently cooperating, he wasn't left idle and was promoted from a deputy emblem regiment to a main emblem regiment. However, he had been demoted from the Central Army of the Empire to the Garrison Army of the Empire. This person was never a core member of Shaya's group. His performance in the Garrison Division was mediocre, neither high nor low, neither good nor bad. He did put in a lot of effort in leading the troops, but his performance would never exceed the value of his salary by even a little bit. Mr. Stephen was a faithful portrayal of the man who did what he was paid for. The fact that such a task was given to such a person naturally caused many people to be surprised. Most of them were envious. Escorting the Empress back to the imperial capital. If he succeeded, it would be a huge merit. If he could escort the Empress back to the imperial capital safely, he would definitely be heavily rewarded and rewarded by the Emperor. He would even receive the gratitude of the Duke of Minas. The Emperor might even make him stay in the imperial capital and take up a new post, never to return to the north. It should be known that most of the old guys in the Northern Army who used to belong to the Central Army were dissatisfied with being taken in by Shaya, a local warlord. If they could return to the imperial capital and re-enter the ranks of the Central Army, even if they were only reinstated, it would be great. It was better than staying in the north and being controlled by Shaya, doing nothing all day and not getting any benefits, by 1,000 times. This choice caused a lot of controversy. Many people even suspected that this Stephen must have bribed a high-ranking official in the Northern Army, or maybe he used Sir Green's connections. Some people also suspected that this Stephen might have some noble blood in his background, which was why he was chosen by the Empress to be the leader of the guards. Most people were more inclined to the latter of the two possibilities. This was because this Mr. Stephen was indeed from a noble family in the imperial capital. Most of the middle and high-ranking officers in the Central Army were from noble families in the imperial capital, and this Mr. Stephen was said to have studied at a military academy in the imperial capital for a short period of time, although he was only sent there for a short period of 2 months. But everyone knew that a military academy in the imperial capital was the base camp for the royalists to cultivate generals. Any general who graduated from a military academy in the imperial capital was considered to be loyal to the royals. The size of the guards was finally decided: 500 cavalrymen and 1,000 infantrymen. No one had any doubts about such a combination of forces and forces. In the eyes of most people, this was the most sensible choice. An escort force of 1,500 people was enough to deal with the threat of some small local warlord, and the presence of 500 cavalrymen would also allow the guards to exert the mobility of the cavalrymen in times of crisis and quickly bring the Empress away from danger. This number was just within the financial range of the Northern Army. At the same time, the Besta military district also sent a message saying that they were willing to meet the Empress's guards on the way and provide supplies. Escorting the Empress from Denzel City back to the imperial capital was strongly supported by most of the generals in the Northern Army. Many people thought that this noble Empress staying in Denzel City would not benefit the Northern Army much, and would instead attract criticism. It was best to send her away as soon as possible. But what no one knew was that on the night this decision was made, a fierce argument broke out in General Shea's bedroom in the garrison residence. This was also the first argument between Shea and Adeline since they confirmed their relationship. The argument was very fierce, and Adeline expressed strong dissatisfaction with Shea's decision to send Daphne back to the imperial capital. "You're sending her to suicide, Shea. You know very well that she will die when she returns to the imperial capital. My brother won't. You're the only one in the world who can protect her now. Shea, I'm begging you. I beg you to agree to my request and let her stay. She can only continue to live by staying in the north. She's my only good friend. Shea, I can't watch her die. I beg you, can you take back this decision?" Regarding Adeline's pleading, dissatisfaction, or anger, Shea didn't say a word from beginning to end, showing unusual silence. In the end, Daphne, who heard the argument, rushed over and interrupted the argument between the two. "This is my own idea, Adeline. I must go back." Daphne was very calm. She gently hugged Adeline and whispered into her ear. "You understand, someone like me, born into this family, my title, my identity, all of these things make it so that I have no freedom. I have my own destiny, and this may be my final destination. Adeline, there is no need to feel sad for me, much less feel sad for me." Adeline wept bitterly and hugged her good friend tightly, unwilling to let go. Finally, Shea walked over and gently knocked Adeline unconscious. Then, he carried his fiancée and placed her on the bed. When he turned around, Shea suddenly saw Daphne's eyes staring at him, so bright that it was shocking. Within Daphne's eyes there seemed to be relief, and there was also a faint trace of resentment. "You really agree to send me back?" Daphne's voice was very calm. "Yes." Shea nodded. "Thank you, General Shea. Thank you for allowing me to complete my destiny." Daphne appeared to be smiling. However, there was a flash of sadness within her eyes. It was a somewhat piercing sight. After a pause, Daphne whispered, "Truth be told, I would prefer that person to be you." "What?" Shea was confused. "The one to send me back." Daphne smiled, a smile that contained a trace of sadness. "If I am destined to die, I hope that the one to escort me on my way is you." After saying that, without waiting for Shea to speak up, Daphne revealed a panicked expression and left as though she was running away. Looking at Daphne's departing figure, Shea was silent. He stood there, not knowing what to say. In the end, he did not say anything. Instead, he simply frowned. Turning back to the bedside, Shea looked at the sleeping poor thing. Then, he bent down and stroked Adeline's delicate face with his rough hand. Next, he brushed aside the messy hair on her forehead. "Don't worry." Shea looked at his sleeping fiancé and said softly, "Your man is not as bad as you think. What you are worried about will not happen." When the Empress set off south from Denzel City, she held a small ceremony in Denzel City. After all, she was the Empress of a country. She could not afford to be inconspicuous. Guards of honor, escorts, and the entourage of officials sent her off. There were even a number of curious citizens of Denzel City who gathered on both sides of the road, wanting to catch a glimpse of the Empress. However, everyone was destined to be disappointed. Because after the carriage came out of the Garrison Manor, the Empress did not show herself. Instead, she stayed in the carriage. The windows of the carriage were tightly shut. The surrounding soldiers with weapons in their hands kept the crowd of onlookers far away. In addition to the original 1,500 escorts, there were also 1,000 of the most elite cavalrymen from the Northern Army accompanying the Empress. However, these cavalrymen would part ways with the Empress and her entourage when they arrived at the new city in Ilton County. These 1,000 cavalrymen were ordered to head east to the Corsica region. As the Corsica region had not been very stable recently, some of the old officials of the former military governor's office had attempted to instigate a rebellion after the situation had stabilized. They wanted to restore the rule of the military governor's office. These 1,000 cavalrymen were ordered to head to the Corsica region to help quell the rebellion. The one leading these 1,000 cavalrymen was none other than Shea's old subordinate and most trusted brother, Sharba. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 533. GOR Chapter 490 Road to the South. As a former officer of the Imperial Central Army, Mr. Stephen was quite capable to be able to rise to the rank of Deputy Emblem Commander. He was not a good-for-nothing. Of course, he was also not a genius. He was in his 30s and had been in the army for 10 years. He had also studied at the Imperial Military Academy for a short period of time. He was quite capable. Of course, the reason why he was able to rise to the rank of Deputy Emblem Commander in the Imperial Central Army was not purely because of his superior military strategy. More importantly, it was because of his family background. Stephen was born into a noble family in the imperial capital. Although it was not considered a top-notch noble family, it was still quite a background. It could be considered a middle-class family that hovered between second-rate and third-rate nobility. Additionally, it stood firmly within the ranks of the royalist faction. Due to his family background, Stephen was considered to have sufficient loyalty and firm stand. In the end, he was able to rise through the ranks. In less than a few years, he was able to rise to the rank of Deputy Emblem Commander in the Imperial Central Army. Originally, Stephen thought that he had a lot of potential in his career. He was still young and came from a good family background. The resume that he had accumulated over the years was more or less enough. Once there was an opportunity, perhaps he could make use of his family's connections and pull some strings to transfer himself back to the imperial capital. Then, he could use the excuse of being knowledgeable in military strategy to transfer himself into the imperial capital's military department or some other department to take up an official position. He would no longer have to endure the hardships of the military and fight for his life on the battlefield. If he did well, he might even be able to reach the rank of deputy director when he retired after 20 or 30 years. Most of the children of noble families spent their lives like this. Unfortunately, Stephen's luck was simply too bad. If everything went as planned, then there was an 80% chance that this idea of his could be realized. Unfortunately, he encountered a war. Odin's men marched south and swept through Ilton County. The Imperial Central Army's 7th Division fought against Odin's men. In the end, the 7th Division of the Imperial Central Army suffered defeat after defeat. In the end, their main force was almost completely wiped out. Fortunately, Stephen was not included in the main force at that time. He led his men and followed the remnants of his army to Denzel City in the Shire of Moor, where he eventually sought refuge under Shea's command. From then on, his dream of an official career had been shattered. The remnants of the 7th Division were then absorbed by Shea, and the Northern Army was established. Obviously, Shea did not trust people like him, who came from a traditional noble family, and those old foxes in the Central Army. Both sides were well aware that they were not on the same side. Many officers of the Central Army who came from noble families looked down on Shea Lei Ming. If it was in the past, they would have to take the initiative to salute them when they met him on the road. But now, not only did he have to depend on someone else's whims, but he had also been taken over by the other party. From now on, he would have to live under someone else's whims. His original position and authority were all taken away, so naturally, he couldn't get any benefits. Although Stephen did not resist, at least he was not completely taken away. He knew very well that with his status, there was no future for him to stay in the Northern Army. This time, he was unexpectedly chosen by Shea to be the commander of the Imperial Guard and be responsible for escorting the Empress back. For Stephen, it was like a pie falling from the sky. After all, he came from a noble family, so he was very familiar with the Empress' background. The Minas family was once the #1 noble family in the army. The Imperial Duke's family. If he could safely escort the Empress back to the Imperial capital, no matter what, the Duke of Minas would definitely reward him handsomely. Similarly, the Emperor's reward would not be light either. As long as he could return to the Imperial capital, with his family's connections, he could think of a way to stay in the Imperial capital. It should not be a problem. From then on, he could leave the Northern Army, which he could not integrate into at all. This was a rare opportunity. Due to this mentality, Stephen was especially meticulous and responsible when it came to escorting the Empress. After setting off from Denzel City, Stephen displayed the attitude of an extremely responsible military officer. Along the way, he carefully sent out a large number of scouts to urge the team to move forward. At the same time, he was also very concerned about the safety of the team. Whether it was traveling, lodging, or stopping for a short rest, he was very careful. Even the water source on the road, he had to send people to carefully check it. It must be known that they were still not out of Shea's sphere of influence. Every morning and evening, he personally went to greet the Empress, displaying the demeanor of a noble. Regardless of whether it was etiquette or attitude, they were all impeccable. He would also ask about the Empress' daily life, food, etc. It could be said that Mr. Stephen had taken into consideration all the details that could be thought of. However, he was somewhat discouraged by the fact that the Empress herself was not too enthusiastic about his courteous greetings. In fact, she was even somewhat cold. Only in the first 2 times the Empress opened the window to greet him personally. She politely exchanged a few words with him, and in a very dignified manner, encouraged Mr. Stephen. However, after that, every time Stephen paid his greetings, he was unable to see the Empress. The Empress would only reply with a few simple and, "Oh, understood," from the window. Twice, even Stephen could hear the suppressed impatience in the Empress' tone. "What the hell? This woman is so beautiful, born in the Empire's #1 noble family, and is also the Empress. Her face seemed to be covered in a layer of frost every day. How could a person of her status not live?" If it was in the past, Stephen would naturally be very tactful and not dare to disturb the Empress. But now, Stephen had clearly lost his composure. He was very clear that for him, being able to interact with the Empress at such a close distance was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If he could gain the Empress' appreciation, or even the slightest bit of goodwill from the Empress, then when he returned to the imperial capital, it would be of great benefit to his plans. He was born in a middle-class noble family, and rarely even saw the Emperor's face. If he could get on the Empress' good side, then, in the future, there was a fire burning in Stephen's heart. The procession traveled all the way to Ilton County, and naturally, it was a safe journey. The accompanying cavalry troop of 1,000 people maintained a distance of about 1 li from the Empress's carriage troop as they slowly marched. Stephen naturally knew General Sharba, who was leading the troop. He was Shea Thunder's confidant and was born in the Rodrier cavalry. However, for a noble like Stephen, he would not really think highly of a civilian officer like Sharba. Along the way, the two did not have any interactions, and only occasionally sent messengers to inform each other of the news. As long as he returned to the imperial capital, he would no longer have anything to do with the Northern Army. Even if Sharba is Shea Thunder's confidant, I don't have to curry favor with him. That was Stephen's thought. When the procession arrived at the new city of Ilton County, the two troops immediately went their separate ways. Sharba's cavalry did not rest in the new city, but after replenishing their supplies, they immediately led the troops east to quell the rebellion in Corsica. The Empress and her entourage entered the new city for a day of rest. The new city had almost become a large construction site. Since Shea decided to move the seat of government to the new city in the future, the new city had begun to be repaired. The city defenses and other fortifications that were destroyed in the war were urgently being repaired, and some of the buildings in the city that were destroyed by the war had also begun to be rebuilt, such as the governor's residence, the barracks outside the city, the granaries and so on. A large number of civilian workers were mobilized to work hard inside and outside the city like ants. As there were construction sites everywhere, a layer of stone dust floated in the air. At night, Daphne, who was resting in the governor's residence, did not sleep at all. She stood on her balcony, overlooking the entire new city. Even at night, she could see lights everywhere in the new city. The construction sites were in full swing, and there were constant shouts from afar. This will be a new city in the north of the empire. It will also be that guy's lair. He will definitely run this place until it is invulnerable. It is foreseeable that this place will become more prosperous than before, that Shea, he will also be like a rising star, lighting up the northern sky of the empire. Unfortunately, she would not be able to see this anymore. Early tomorrow morning, she would leave the new city and head south. Everything in the north, what she had encountered these days, everything would it would only become a cloud of smoke in a dream, slowly dissipating. Daphne held onto the railing tightly, her fingers a little white because of the excessive force. The second time, the troops left the new city and headed south. Stephen ordered the troops to speed up their march. The large group of carriages and horses traveled for more than 10 days before they finally left the borders of Ilton County and officially entered the territory of the Besta people. The Besta governor's wife kept her promise. She sent a troop of cavalry and brought along 200 large carriages. 200 large carriages allowed the infantry in the army to finally break away from the belief of trekking on foot. After the infantry sat in the carriages, the speed of the march increased significantly. It was obvious that the governor's wife also wanted to send this troublesome person away from her territory as soon as possible. The Besta people spared no effort in providing them with supplies and even some horses. There were also cavalry escorts along the way. It took less than 15 days to cross the Besta region. What made Stephen a little dissatisfied was that the governor's wife did not appear to meet Her Highness the Empress. For a noble like Stephen, he felt that this was a very rude thing to do. After leaving the territory of the Besta people, Stephen ordered the troops to continue to speed up their advance. He knew very well that they had entered enemy territory. In the future, when they went south, they would first have to pass through the territories of 4 small rebel warlords. Stephen estimated that this journey should not be too dangerous. They had a military strength of 1,500 people, and the small warlords might not be willing to send troops to fight a bitter battle with them. Moreover, even if things did not go well, he could still use the cavalry to escape with the Empress. The biggest danger should be the military districts of Armenia. To return to the capital, the military districts of Armenia were a huge mountain that they had to climb. As the top force in the rebel camp, Armenia had a strong military strength and vast territory. That would be the time to test himself. However, Stephen was not too worried. He had already thought of what he thought was an excellent idea. He had thought about it long before they set off. As soon as they got close to the territory of the military districts of Armenia, he would immediately give the order to split up the troops. He would abandon the 1,000 infantrymen in the group, as well as all the other members of the entourage, such as maids and servants, all of them. He would only bring the Empress and a few hundred cavalry with him. They would charge through the Armenian territory at the fastest speed possible. The abandoned troops could also be used as a distraction to attract the Armenian troops to chase after them. As for those people who were abandoned in his plan, Stephen would not feel the slightest bit of guilt. As for guilt, what a joke! As long as he could protect the Empress and reach the capital safely, it would be the greatest contribution. At that time, who would pursue these matters? Of course, he would not reveal this plan to anyone now. As long as he could reach the imperial capital, then promotion and wealth, glory and splendor would be just around the corner. Finally, on the 29th day after they set off from Denzel City, the troops walked out of the territory of the Besta people and officially entered enemy territory. Hurry up! We have to cross the Agate River in front of us before dark, and then stop at the south bank. Damn it! Keep your spirits up! Stephen rode back and forth in front of the troops, shouting and yelling to get the soldiers to keep their spirits up. However, the effect was not very good. Because of his impatience and repeated requests to speed up, the troops were already very tired. Although the Besta people provided a large number of carriages for the infantrymen to travel, the soldiers' bones were about to fall apart after sitting in the carriages for several days on the bumpy journey. The Besta people's carriages were not like the carriages of the nobles that had anti-vibration devices, nor were they covered with soft carpets. Those were just carriages specially used to transport goods. After a day of riding on them, almost all the bones in their bodies were broken, and everyone's backs were sore. As for the cavalry, they had been trekking for so many days that the inside of their thighs were almost bleeding from the friction of the saddles. It must be said that these 500 cavalrymen were not the roadrear cavalry under Shea's command. Including the 1,000 infantrymen behind them, they were all drawn from the Northern Army's 2nd Corps, which was the garrison regiment. These infantrymen were originally part of Stephen's team, the team that he led. Most of them were originally from the 7th Corps and some local garrison troop. During the reorganization of the army, they were not selected to join the 1st Corps, but were eliminated from the garrison regiment. The composition of these 500 cavalrymen was also quite interesting. 400 of them were not real cavalrymen, but were originally a troop of mounted infantry from the garrison regiment, the so-called mobile infantry. Only 100 of them were real cavalrymen. These 100 cavalrymen were the real elites that Shea had specially transferred to strengthen the strength of the garrison regiment. These 100 cavalrymen were the mounted bandits that had followed them in the past. These mounted bandit cavalrymen had served in the army and trained with the roadrear cavalry. Their level of elite was no less than that of the roadrear cavalry. However, the mounted bandits' innate valiance and arrogance gave Stephen a headache. He could clearly feel that these 100 cavalrymen were somewhat incompatible with his own troops, and they were lazy to carry out his orders. He had heard that the cavalrymen of the Northern Army, the real elite cavalrymen, in the entire Northern Army, there were only 4 people who could command them. The first one to bear the brunt of it was naturally Shea Thunder. Next was the commander of the Northern Army's cavalry, Sharba. The other 2 were Reinhardt. Reinhardt had once led the remnants of the Roadrear cavalry from the south to the north to join Shea. Along the way, he had fought bloody battles and formed a deep friendship with the cavalrymen. The last one was said to be a special existence within the Northern Army, the only female officer, the one called Nene. With the exception of these 4 people, the other generals within the Northern Army would find it difficult to command these cavalrymen. These 100 cavalrymen did not cause any trouble for him along the way. In all honesty, be it in terms of rushing, stopping, or scouting, these truly elite cavalrymen were at least 10 times better than his second- and third-rate subordinate. However, their eyes of disdain and arrogance had never been concealed. They looked down on Stephen and had never shown him any respect. "Just you wait. When we reach the imperial capital, watch how I deal with these bastards." Stephen muttered to himself and raised his horsewhip to urge them on. "Hurry! Hurry! We must cross the river before nightfall. Hurry!" The soldiers under his command were already exhausted, and could only barely move forward under his whips and yells. The 100 elite cavalrymen were still in formation, but they wandered outside the main group and watched Stephen make a fool of himself from afar. They watched as he drove the soldiers back and forth like a flock of sheep. "What the hell? Why would the young master send us to command this fellow? This fellow is like mud. What right does he have to give us orders?" A mounted bandit grumbled in dissatisfaction. "Look at these fellows, all of them are like mud. We are the brave warriors of the cavalry regiment, why do we have to work with these fellows?" Another mounted bandit leader frowned and stopped his companions, grumbling. "Enough, all of you shut up. The young master's orders naturally make sense. Carry out the orders. Damn it, don't forget the young master's orders before we left. This fellow is unreliable. If something really happens, we brothers will have to clean up the mess. All of you better be alert." Pausing, the mounted bandit leader muttered to himself and said, "That Stephen is an idiot. It's one thing to cross the river at night, but he actually forced his way through and did not send anyone to scout ahead. Damn it, send 20 of our brothers to scout ahead. Stand guard by the river and provide support for the main group. Also, send people to the nearby forest to keep watch. This is no longer our territory, so make the area more guarded. It's better to be safe than sorry." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 534. Yep, this chapter was updated a little late. I was writing it smoothly and accidentally wrote 10,000 words. GOR Chapter 491. A Taste of Happiness. Truth be told, Stephen's request to cross the Agate River at night was not simply because he wanted to be reckless. He had his own considerations. They had already entered enemy territory, and he was well aware of the value of the Empress in his group. She would surely attract the attention of the rebel forces along the way. At a time like this, the best course of action was to make haste and flee far away before the enemy forces could make any preparations. The Agate River was a large river in front of them. If they couldn't cross the river tonight and waited until dawn, they would be discovered by the nearby rebel forces and be hunted down by a large group of people. It would be bad for them. The large group of people finally arrived at the riverside when the sky turned dark. More than 20 cavalrymen had arrived earlier and checked the surroundings. Due to the approaching summer, the water level was at its most abundant. Thus, the river, which was not too famous, appeared to be quite turbulent. Some of the soldiers tried walking into the river. However, when the water level reached their chest, they dared not move forward. Clearly, the depth of the river made it impossible for them to force their way across. If they were to swim across, their group would have to abandon all their vehicles and supplies. Additionally, how could Stephen have the courage to ask the Empress to personally swim across the river? Is there no bridge nearby? Stephen frowned and asked the mounted soldiers who were scouting the way. These elite mounted soldiers were originally mounted bandit. Although they did not think highly of their commanding officer, due to military orders, they had to answer the question seriously. I have heard that there is a bridge downstream. However, there is a camp of rebel forces stationed there. They have also built a fortification on the riverbank. If we were to cross the river from there, we would have to face the rebel forces head-on. We are mounted soldiers. If we were to fight in the open, it would not be a problem. However, if the enemy forces are to defend the bridge and use their arrows to stop us from crossing the river, I fear. Stephen was no idiot. He was well versed in military strategy. He knew that if they were to force their way across the bridge, the enemy would only need to use 200 soldiers to make use of the terrain, fortifications and arrows to stop them. That would be enough to inflict heavy losses on them. Let's build the pontoon bridge. Stephen sighed. We don't have much time. We have to cross this river before dawn. Have the soldiers overturn the carriages into the river to build a pontoon bridge. This order made the infantrymen very dissatisfied, because if the carriages were pushed into the river, they would be able to quickly build a pontoon bridge, but once they crossed the river, the infantrymen would have to suffer without the carriages to travel. These infantrymen were not the elites of the Northern Army. Most of them were veterans and a small number of rookies who had been eliminated from the Central Army. When they heard that they had to contribute their carriages, all of them began to complain. They only reluctantly started working under Stephen's whips and scoldings. After all, there were no craftsmen in the team, nor did they bring any tools. It was even more unrealistic to cut down trees to obtain materials to build the pontoon bridge. When the soldiers finally pushed more than 20 carriages into the river, they anxiously abandoned many of their supplies and chests. Stephen walked back and forth on the shore with a whip in his hand, supervising the work. The soldiers were busy for almost half a night before they barely managed to build the pontoon bridge. This was a very simple and crude pontoon bridge. But then came the problem. This was a temporary pontoon bridge. It would be no problem for people to walk across it. But, if the Empress wanted to drive that luxurious carriage across, then it would be impossible. Stephen struggled in his heart, but finally made up his mind. He had no choice but to personally seek an audience with Daphne and explain the situation. He thought that he would be angrily reprimanded by the Empress, but to his surprise, Daphne only nodded calmly. All right, then throw away the carriage and cross the river on foot. Stephen was flattered that the Empress was so easy to talk to. He hurriedly knelt down. Your Highness, my horse is a well-trained one. Your Majesty, please transfer to my horse to continue the journey. However, Daphne did not have much of a reaction to his fawning actions. She only nodded and accepted it. Stephen could not help but feel a little gloomy. The troops began to cross the river. The pontoon bridge was very narrow and not very sturdy. Only the infantry could walk on it, while the cavalry could only swim. Stephen handed his horse to his subordinates and personally escorted the Empress across the river. Dozens of infantry crossed the pontoon bridge first and stood guard on the other side. Stephen then put on a loyal look and followed the Empress closely. Unfortunately, Daphne did not seem to be interested in looking at him, so Stephen felt more and more helpless. When Daphne finally set foot on the other side of the river, Stephen finally let out a sigh of relief. He knew that the soldiers were very reluctant when they were working. The bridge was built so crudely that if the Empress had fallen into the water halfway, he would have had no choice but to draw his sword and slit his own throat if anything happened to her. The cavalry also began to swim. Although the horses could swim, they still needed the knight to have good horse control skills to urge them. The speed of the cavalry crossing the river was somewhat slow, and the narrowness of the bridge made it difficult for the infantry to cross the river. After the time it took to eat a meal, the infantry had only crossed less than a third of the bridge, while the cavalry were still preparing to remove their armor on the other side of the river. Luckily, it was a quiet night, and it seemed like the enemy had not discovered the tracks of his men. Stephen comforted himself in his heart. Unfortunately, just as this self-comforting thought flashed through the officer's mind, whoosh! Not far from the river bank, in a sparse forest, a fire suddenly erupted into the sky. Whoosh! The sound of something breaking through the air. When the veteran Stephen heard this, his heart almost jumped out of his chest. In his panic, he suddenly exclaimed, "Enemy attack!" His voice had just left his mouth when a strong gust of wind brushed past his cheek. With a whoosh, an arrow shot into the ground behind him. "Enemy attack! Enemy attack!" The team immediately panicked. Stephen pulled out his saber and shouted, "Find cover! Don't panic!" Stephen's heart was filled with grief and indignation. The enemy archers seemed to be aiming at him, and the arrows that were flying towards him seemed to have locked onto him. Two of the arrows brushed past his body, and the last arrow directly hit his leather helmet. With a whoosh, Stephen's soul almost flew out of his body. They were not elites to begin with. With the sudden appearance of flames and arrows in the darkness, the soldiers scattered in confusion, each looking for a place to hide. Some even laid flat on the river bank. Shouts of killing could already be heard from the distant forest where flames soared into the sky. Several voices could be heard one after another. "Don't run, these fat sheep! Kill that officer! Surround them! Surround them! Let them escape!" Stephen's heart was filled with shock. At that moment, a voice that caused his liver and guts to shatter rang out, finally shattering the last trace of courage in his heart. "Da-da! Da-da! Da-da!" In the darkness, the sound was so clear that Stephen's body turned cold when he heard it. Horse hooves. It was the sound of horse hooves. This group of people who ambushed him in the middle of the night actually had cavalry. He was a military officer. Although his abilities were mediocre, he at least understood one thing. The terrain of this river bank was flat, and he only had a small number of scattered infantry. He did not even have any archers. At this moment, if the enemy cavalry were to charge over, forget about resisting, it would be a one-sided massacre. His only hope and savior was the cavalry on the other side of the river behind him. He turned back to look and saw that the cavalry on the other side of the river had already sped up. The 100 truly elite cavalrymen reacted the fastest. Some of the leading officers were already yelling loudly, instructing their subordinates to quickly cross the river. Some of them didn't even have time to take off their armor and equipment, so they simply forced their warhorses to gallop across the pontoon bridge. Some did not even have time to urge their warhorses to swim, so they simply took off their clothes, bit their sabers and jumped into the river to swim over. At this critical moment, elites were elites after all. On the other hand, Stephen's own cavalrymen were in a much worse state. They were huddled together in a mess. Some of them tried to swim in a hurry, but they threw away their weapons. Some of them didn't even have time to take off their armor, and couldn't swim at all after entering the water. What made Stephen even angrier was that someone actually got on his horse and ran away in the direction behind him. He actually escaped just like that. Stephen's mind was blank. He hid in a depression on the river bank to avoid the arrows. Suddenly, he thought of something. Where is the Empress? The thought caused his body to turn cold. He raised his head and looked around. What he saw was a figure in a dress lying on the ground in the midst of the chaos on the river bank. The figure was vaguely the Empress herself. There was an arrow stuck in her body, and there were faint traces of blood on the ground beside her. Stephen's vision turned dark. He did not know where his courage came from. He suddenly roared out and jumped up from the depression. The saber in his hand danced in an attempt to block the incoming arrows. He quickly rushed to the side of the figure and grabbed the wrist of the person on the ground. Then, he dragged her to the side. Lao Tzu's future. Lao Tzu's glory and wealth. Lao Tzu's career. But all of it was on her. She cannot die. She cannot die. Stephen's eyes turned red. Desperately dragging the Empress to the side, Stephen anxiously shouted, "Your Highness! Your Highness!" "I am fine." Daphne's voice was trembling. However, she did not sound panicked. She whispered, "Your Excellency, please let me go. I did not get hit by the arrow." Daphne raised her head and Stephen finally gave a sigh of relief. The Empress was not hit by the arrow. However, there were some bloodstains on her skirt. "Your Highness? You?" "I fell and broke my leg. It is not a big deal." Daphne felt a sense of gratitude toward this officer who had risked his life to save her. She sighed and said, "Thank you, Mr. Stephen. Rest assured, Your Highness. I will protect you and kill our way out." Stephen gritted his teeth. Daphne gave a faint smile and said, "There is no need. Since we were ambushed, the other party must have made preparations. Their target must be me. General Stephen, if you do not want to die, then listen to me. Take your men and jump into the river, and swim back to the other side to escape." Stephen's heart trembled. He did not expect the Empress to say such words. Arrows flew back and forth above their heads. The sound of arrows piercing through the air was endless. Stephen was at a loss. He wanted to risk his life, but the Empress' indifferent attitude left him at a loss. At this time, he suddenly heard a cry of alarm from one of his subordinates. "They are here! They are here! They are here!" Stephen raised his head and saw a black shadow darting out from the direction of the forest. The man was like the wind, the horse was like a dragon. The sound of the horse's hooves hitting the ground was rapid and crisp. The figure on the horse looked so sinister and frightening against the backdrop of the burning forest. It was a black horse, and its rider was dressed in black from head to toe. His face was covered in a leather armor, and he had already arrived before them like a whirlwind. Stephen struggled in his heart. Finally, he saw the man charging in front of him. Steeling his heart, he roared and leapt up with his blade. "Lao Tzu, I will fight you to the death." He slashed out with his blade, the blade's light falling down with an extraordinary momentum. At this moment of life and death, Stephen's martial arts skills exceeded his standard. This slash was full of power. It was a pity that the knight didn't even look at Stephen. He raised the huge axe in his hand. With a bang, Stephen's saber flew up into the sky. He also fell down and sat on the ground. His hand that was holding the saber was covered in blood. He sat on the ground, feeling intense pain all over his body. Seeing the man riding past him, Stephen closed his eyes and waited for death. At this time, there was no way he could resist. He could only wait for the man to pass by. With a swing of the axe, his head would be cut off, but after waiting for a long time, the axe did not come. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the man had already reached the depression. While on the horse, he bent down and pulled Daphne up from the ground. He threw her onto the back of the horse and shouted, urging the horse to gallop to the side. First, the disorderly infantry tried to stop him. But the man did not bother to fight. He only urged the horse to gallop, knocking aside the infantry blocking his way. He rushed through the crowd and laughed wildly from afar. His hoarse voice was filled with greed. "The Empress is in my hands. Brothers, run!" Seeing that the horse had gone far away, although there were still soldiers on his side shouting and chasing, how could they catch up? Stephen sat on the ground. His whole body was cold, and he did not even have the strength to stand up. These people have taken the Empress. Sure enough, there were no more arrows flying from the woods. The noise also quieted down, and there was no more movement. Then, waiting for his side to quiet down, Stephen sent people to search the woods. Not even half a shadow of the enemy was left. The cavalry crossed the river. Stephen flew into a rage and ordered the cavalry to search in all directions. He himself sat on the spot in a daze, his eyes blank. Lost the Empress. What am I going to do? The horse under her galloped and bumped all the way, but Daphne did not panic at all. But the man who took her did not forget to leave a hand to support her from time to time as he galloped. Daphne did not know how long they galloped like this before she heard the man shout and reined in the horse. When the horse's hooves gradually slowed, they finally galloped into a forest. As the terrain gradually rose, Daphne could tell that this seemed to be a road into the mountains. The road was rugged and there were branches poking out from both sides from time to time. But the knight on the horse waved his axe and chopped off the branches one after another. Not a single branch scraped Daphne's body. They went all the way into the mountains. When they reached the depths of the mountains, the air that they could smell carried the damp smell of the night in the forest deep in the mountains. The horse finally stopped. The man on the horse turned over and jumped off the horse. He then carried Daphne up from the horse and placed her on the ground. Daphne's expression was calm as she sat on the ground. The dew on the grass wet the hem of her skirt. The man in front of her had a fierce aura and was holding a shining axe in his hand. Under the leather helmet, his eyes were staring fiercely at her. Then, a hoarse voice with a hint of evil rang out. "Heh, I heard that the Empress is a great beauty. Haha, now you're in the hands of Lao Tzu, great beauty. Lao Tzu must have some fun first." As he spoke, he made a gesture of reaching out his hand. Daphne did not move. She just sat on the ground, but raised her eyes and looked at the man quietly. Daphne waited until the man's hand was about to press on her shoulder before she sighed faintly and said in a low voice, "Shea, do you always like to mess around like this?" The man's hand suddenly froze. Then, he said in a rough voice, "What, Shea? This lord has never changed my name. I have roamed Harati County for more than 10 years and killed countless people. The one known as the Whirlwind Bandit is this lord." As he spoke, he raised his axe and swung it down. With a bang, a rock next to him was chopped into pieces by the man's axe. Daphne looked at the man in front of her. Her originally calm face suddenly burst into laughter. Her laughter was like a blooming flower. Her eyes were filled with gentleness. The man in front of her could not help but stare blankly. Then, Daphne covered her mouth and said softly, "What whirlwind bandit? Sigh, Shea, you're not young anymore. Why do you always like to make jokes like this? Yes, you were merciful just now and snatched me out, but you didn't really hurt anyone. Otherwise, with the power of your axe just now, that guy called Stephen wouldn't have been able to survive under your hands." The man smiled wryly and finally sighed. His hoarse voice reverted back to its original voice. He took off the leather helmet covering his face to reveal the face that Daphne was familiar with. "Woman, you really are very astute." Shea gave a somewhat embarrassed smile and casually tossed the axe in his hand into the grass. Then, he sat down in front of Daphne and scratched his head. When did you recognize me?" Daphne's eyes appeared very calm. However, there was a strange expression on her face as she quietly stared at Shea. Then, she said in a low voice, "Just now, when you threw me onto the horse's back." Shea was puzzled. "Your aura." Daphne's pale cheeks suddenly blushed and her voice became almost inaudible. "Your aura, the smell on your body, I can recognize it." There was a deep meaning behind those words. However, Shea was oblivious to it. He simply muttered inwardly, "Does this woman have a dog's nose?" The expression in Daphne's eyes as she looked at Shea seemed to become softer and softer. Her eyes quietly gazed at Shea. The hidden meaning in her eyes made Shea somewhat at a loss, and he couldn't help but feel somewhat uncomfortable. He subconsciously tilted his head and coughed. Daphne, thank you." Daphne suddenly spoke up softly, interrupting Shea's words. You don't have to. Shea was about to say something when Daphne suddenly reached out with her soft little hand to firmly grasp Shea's hand. Her pair of watery eyes stared intently at Shea. Thank you, Shea. Thank you. Daphne's voice was so low that it sounded as though she was whispering. You made so many arrangements, selecting people, sending guards, and even sending me here over 1,000 miles, all for the sake of snatching me away? I really did not expect you to do this, going through so much trouble just to save me. And you even came here personally. Shea snickered. There is no other way. If this matter is to be done secretly, I would not feel at ease leaving it to others. With so many people around, it is inevitable that this matter will be leaked out. When that time comes, I fear that I will not be able to suppress those voices of doubt. I will have to do it myself. Don't worry, from today onwards you are free. Free. Daphne's eyes were somewhat downcast. Yes, you are free. Shea sternly said in a loud voice. I snatched you away, and once the news spreads out, people will naturally think that you were snatched away halfway. Later, I will do some tricks and get a corpse to change into your clothes and throw it outside. After it is discovered, the whole world will think that you, Daphne, the Empress of the Empire, have been ambushed and died on the way back to the imperial capital. From now on, Daphne, Empress of the Empire, this identity no longer exists in this world. From today onwards, you are a new person. You can start a new life. What you want to do, how you want to live, it is all your freedom. You no longer have to carry the burden of your family. What bullshit glory. What bullshit fate. You can let them all go to hell. But what about you? Daphne frowned and shook her head with a sigh. You sent someone to escort me, but something like this happened on the way back. The imperial capital will definitely blame it on you. TSK. Shea laughed proudly. With Lao Tzu's current identity, what can that little emperor do to me? If he really dares to anger Lao Tzu will directly become a warlord and rebel. Even if that little emperor has 2 guts, he won't dare to do anything to me. His words were bold, but they were actually just big words. If he really wanted to rebel, Shea was far from qualified. The army under him was still loyal to the Empire, and Green and the others were even more loyal to the Empire. If Shea really dared to rebel, then the morale of the army would likely be thrown into chaos. When that time comes, it would be hard to say how many people would be willing to continue being traitors with him. Besides, as long as Adric was still around, Shea would definitely not dare to rebel. Those words were only said for the sake of Daphne's heart. You can change your name, change your identity, and then come back with me. You can live in Denzel City, the new city, wherever you like. Then, you can live however you want. Under my rule, I can ensure your safety. There will be no danger at all. As long as you keep a low profile, no one will notice. Shea laughed. I will only tell this to Adeline. I think she will be very happy to know. You took such a big risk just to save me. Daphne said softly. I am not the kind of little girl who doesn't know anything. I know very well how big a risk you took to do this. Shea, if the slightest bit of this matter is leaked out, your reputation will be ruined. You won't be able to answer to your subordinates. You won't be able to answer to the imperial capital. At any rate, I have already done it. Am I supposed to send you back now? Shea stared at Daphne. I can't just watch as you go back to the imperial capital to die. If I do that, Adeline will probably hate me to death in the future. But how am I supposed to live in the future? A hint of a smile suddenly appeared on Daphne's face. Shea was puzzled. How are you going to live? You can live however you want, that? I don't know anything. Daphne shook her head. With the exception of the title of Empress, I don't know anything else. I don't know how to make money, cook, or even sew clothes. If I have to live alone, I will starve to death in less than 3 days. What is there to be afraid of? I will support you, Shea blurted out. Daphne's body trembled. Her pair of beautiful eyes quietly stared at Shea. No matter how slow Shea was, he understood that his words just now were very inconvenient. He could not help but feel embarrassed. He coughed and forced a smile. What I mean is, I am still very rich. No matter what, you are still my friend. I can't just watch as a friend starves to death. The more he spoke, the more awkward he felt. Finally, he coughed twice and said loudly, all right. You are really a strange woman. I spent so much effort to get you out. Now that you are free, you should be happy. Where did all these messy questions come from? Come, let's not think about those useless things for now. Let's be happy first. Daphne finally gave a faint sigh. Then, she took a deep breath and a smile finally bloomed on her face. She looked at Shea and smiled sweetly. Then, using an unprecedentedly relaxed and carefree voice, she said, all right. Then, Mr. Whirlwind Bandit, I am very hungry now. May I ask how you will solve the problem of our stomachs? The problem of their stomachs was easily solved. For a skilled hunter like Shea, he was like a fish in water in this deep mountain. In just a moment, he had dug out a wild beast's nest and caught 2 deer. The 2 walked to a stream and skinned the game to wash. During the process, Daphne wanted to help. At first, Shea did not allow it. He only felt that this woman was clumsy and did not know anything. However, Daphne insisted on doing it herself. She said that she had never done such things in her life and only wanted to give it a try. Shea had no choice but to let Daphne help. As expected, the more she helped, the more trouble she caused. The 2 deer were washed until dawn. In the end, Shea could only sigh and dissuade her. If you delay any longer, I'm afraid that by the time we get to eat, our hair will have turned white. Daphne giggled and finally gave up. She washed her hands in the stream and hugged her knees as she sat by the stream, quietly watching Shea prepare the game. From beginning to end, she stared unblinkingly at Shea with those charming eyes of hers. Shea did not pay too much attention at first, but gradually became a little abnormal. In the end, he could not take it any more and smiled bitterly. No matter how hungry you are, you don't have to look at me so anxiously. Sigh. It's all your fault. If you had let me do it from the beginning, we would have finished eating by now. Daphne was not angry at this blockhead of a man. She smiled sweetly and got up to leave. By the time Shea finished washing the 2 game and returned, he saw Daphne already skipping back and forth, carrying piles of branches to help Shea start a fire. Daphne had always been pampered and had never done such things. It was inevitable that she would make a fool of herself. Shea was too embarrassed to point out that most of the branches she carried were wet wood, so he had to pick out the dry branches himself. Waiting for the bonfire to ignite, a ball of warmth immediately spread throughout his body. Sitting beside the bonfire, Daphne watched Shea skewer the game and throw it over the bonfire to roast. Her childish heart suddenly arose, and she forcefully blew at the bonfire, immediately spraying a ball of black ash onto Shea's face. Shea laughed, grabbed a handful of soil and threw it over. The 2 of them laughed and played with each other for a while. Shea was not very interested in such childish things at first, but seeing that Daphne was in a rare mood, he played with her for a while. But gradually, Daphne's beautiful smile became too infectious. Even Shea was gradually mesmerized by it. He could not help but feel that once this woman smiled, her charm was astonishing. That little Emperor Garcia must be blind. He did not love such a beautiful woman, but liked men instead. The 2 of them played around for a while until the food was ready. Only then did they sit down quietly to eat. Because Daphne was messing around while Shea was preparing the food, the taste of the food was inevitably reduced, and it was far from Shea's usual standards. But this slightly burnt food was a delicacy that Daphne had never tasted before in her life. She seemed to have completely let go of her worries and wolfed down the food, no longer caring about her appearance. Her mouth was greasy from eating, and even when Shea took out a bag of wine to drink alone, she blushed and asked to drink some. Shea did not think much and threw the bag of wine over. Daphne caught it, but her face was red. Suppressing the wild beating of her heart, she took a sip from the bag of wine. His mouth drank from this bag. If I drink from it, wouldn't it be two people? Daphne blushed, but Shea did not mind, thinking that this woman could not hold her liquor. After finishing the food, the two of them sat down in front of the fire and finally quieted down. Shea was silent for a moment before slowly saying, "When dawn comes, we will head back. After we return to Ilton County, I will arrange for you to stay in a place first. After a few days, I will give you a new identity then." "Shea, what about the soldiers escorting me?" Daphne sighed. "They must be in a state of panic right now. If they lose me, I'm afraid," Shea smiled faintly. "I'm not that much of a bastard. I won't abandon those 1,500 people. I've already made arrangements. There are 100 of my elite cavalrymen in the escort team. The leader has my secret order. If anything happens along the way, they can show my secret order and take over the command. Then, they can return with the escort team. As for that Stephen, I know that his mind is filled with thoughts of returning to the imperial capital. When the time comes, he can come with us. If he wants to go to the imperial capital, he can go alone. My men will not care about him. However, I believe that if he loses you, he will not dare to return to the imperial capital. If Garcia finds out that I was robbed and killed on the way back, I fear that he will not punish Stephen. Instead, he will reward him." Daphne gave a faint sigh. "Let's not talk about that fellow for now." Shea smiled. "It's rare for me to be in such a good mood. Why bring up that annoying fellow?" There was a complicated smile on Daphne's face. However, she did as Shea said and kept her mouth shut. She simply sat before the fire and closed her eyes to enjoy the warmth of the flames. After a long time, Daphne opened her eyes and looked at the dark sky. After dawn, will we be leaving this place?" Shea nonchalantly picked up 2 pieces of firewood and tossed them into the fire, causing it to burn brighter. "Shea." Daphne's soft voice drifted over. "Tonight is the happiest night of my life." "Thank you." Shea was slightly taken aback. "Then," he said, "from now on your life will always be this happy." "From now on, no." Daphne shook her head. Although her voice was soft, her tone was firm. "This is the happiest night of my life. I will remember this night for the rest of my life." Shea finally sensed that there was something wrong with the atmosphere. He coughed and mumbled, it's late. Hurry up and go to sleep. You rest well. I'll keep watch. After dawn, we can leave this place. I hope that the sky will never light up and stay dark forever." Daphne sighed softly. The two of them were silent for a long time. Then, Daphne's face turned red. A strange light seemed to flash within her eyes as she slowly opened her mouth. "Shea, I remember you telling me that from now on, you must live for yourself, is that right?" Yes." Shea thought for a moment and said, "In order to live for yourself, do what you like to do what you want to do, and live the life you want to live. If life can't be like this, then what fun is there?" "Really, can I?" Daphne's voice was filled with difficulty. "Of course." Shea gave a faint smile. "Today you are free. From now on, you can live like this for the rest of your life." After saying that, he lowered his head and continued to fiddle with the firewood within the fire. "No need for the rest of my life. Or for the rest of my life." Daphne appeared to have made up her mind. She suddenly stood up and stood beside the fire. She quietly stared at Shea. Just one night is enough. Just one night I can do what I want to do what I have always wanted to do. Just one night, this happiness, this freedom, this happiness. Just one night, that is enough." Her voice was calm, but it carried a certain tone of determination. Hearing that, Shea felt surprised. He raised his head and was about to say something when he saw Daphne's appearance. Shea's mouth gaped open as he stared dumbfoundedly at the woman before him. At that very moment, Daphne was standing silently beside the raging fire. She stood there in the darkness of the night. She was completely naked. Her clothes were at her feet, and her pair of delicate and fair feet were standing on the soft grass. The light from the fire shone upon her body, seemingly painting her white jade-like body with a faint layer of crimson red. The woman lowered her head, seemingly unable to suppress her embarrassment. However, her pair of eyes courageously looked straight at Shea. She did not avert her gaze in the slightest. Under the illumination of the fire, Shea could clearly see every detail of her body. Her delicate white skin, her thin shoulders, the proud fullness of her chest, her slender waist, her small and adorable navel, her slender legs were straight and close together. This was a nearly perfect body, so perfect that there was not the slightest flaw. Shea was completely dumbfounded. He had completely lost his consciousness and could only stare dumbfoundedly at the woman before him. Daphne's body trembled slightly in the darkness of the night. Slowly, step by step, she walked toward Shea. Then, she bent her waist and knelt down on the soft grass. Her body gently rested upon Shea's chest. Shea's body stiffened. He did not know where to place his hands. Despite his blank mind, he could clearly feel, how soft and fragrant this woman in his embrace was. I don't need a future. I don't need a lifetime. I just need tonight. By his ear, the woman whispered, I won't be greedy. I just need one night of happiness. It's enough for me to remember it for the rest of my life. That soft body was nestled in his embrace. Even though they were separated by his clothes, Shea could still feel the other's full and bouncy chest. At the same time, the body in his embrace was shivering. I've never done it before. So, please. Didn't you say that the meaning of happiness is to do what you want to do? Tonight, what I want to do the most is this: to give myself to you. The last words Shea heard before he regained consciousness were, Shea, actually, I love you. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 535. Gior Chapter 492. Her Highness the Empress. The air was filled with the faint fragrance of green grass. Beneath them was a soft meadow. In the summer, the forest was lush with vegetation. In the early morning, the forest was still filled with a faint hazy mist. This kind of mist lingered around them, giving them a damp and cool feeling. When they opened their eyes, they could see the lush tree above them. Faint sunlight shone through the gaps between the branches, not dazzling at all. The branches and leaves were filled with exuberant green. There were already birds singing, chirping and chirping. From time to time, there would be a few pheasants with colorful feathers jumping across the branches. Not far away was the stream. The gurgling sound of the stream sounded so clear and sweet in the morning. Shea took a deep breath. A trace of tenderness flashed through his eyes. Then, he lowered his eyelids and looked at the woman in his arms. A white jade-like arm was wrapped around Shea's neck. Golden hair spread across Shea's chest. That charming face was pressed against his shoulder. Her breathing was even, as if she was still sleeping soundly. Even though she was sleeping soundly, there was still a sweet and satisfied smile on her beautiful face. Only the tear stains at the corner of her eyes and the kiss marks on her white and soft neck seemed to be faintly telling of the wild storm they experienced last night. Under a thin leather robe that served as a quilt, the bodies of the man and woman were still in the nude position. The woman was nestled in Shea's arms. Almost every part of her soft and beautiful body was tightly pressed against Shea's. Even though he had already experienced the satisfaction of last night, after waking up, the woman's exquisite body pressed against him. That kind of amazing temptation was still so soul-stirring. Shea took a deep breath, letting the fresh morning air circulate in his lungs before slowly exhaling. The frenzy last night was still vivid in his mind, as if everything had happened so suddenly. Shea clearly remembered letting this woman throw her naked body into his arms. Under such an occasion, under such an atmosphere, such a woman bared her heart to him and told him of her love. The string of reason in Shea's heart finally broke completely. Then everything that should have happened happened. In the end, when did it start? When did it start? Shea clearly had a thought in his mind. It seemed that when everything happened last night, in addition to being surprised, there seemed to be a faint sense of satisfaction, as if he had fulfilled his wish, as if it seemed that he had been coveting this woman for a long time. Well, yes, it was like that. When this body threw herself into his arms, in addition to being surprised, there was also a faint desire and expectation. It was as if everything that had happened was exactly what he had in mind. Then when did he start to be secretly moved by this woman? Was it that shocking glance at the lakeside on the outskirts of the capital? Or was it that night in Denzel City, in the embrace in the small courtyard? Or was it that day when he saw her weakly crying in his arms, that delicate helplessness finally pierced his heart? Shea could not tell, nor did he want to tell. Anyway, it's already done, the country bumpkin muttered. The two bodies hidden under the leather robe were tightly pressed together, causing a fire to suddenly ignite in the heart of the man who woke up in the morning. There was no doubt that the woman in his arms was beautiful, and this beauty had the youthfulness of a young girl and the maturity of a woman. The combination of these two strange qualities formed a charm that made Shea infatuated. He quietly tightened his thick arms, hugged the woman's slender waist tightly, and felt the amazing curves of the woman's body. His face suddenly felt itchy. Shea raised his eyelids, only to find that Daphne had also woken up. She was blinking her beautiful eyes, quietly gazing at him. Daphne's cheeks were flushed, her eyes filled with deep affection. There was adoration, infatuation, worship, gratitude. Any man who was stared at by a beautiful woman in his arms would find it hard not to be moved. Daphne's breath blew on Shea's cheek, and the itchy feeling seemed to penetrate deep into his heart. Shea took a deep breath, hugged Daphne, and unceremoniously kissed her alluring lips, unrestrainedly tasting the fragrance of the woman's lips. After a long kiss that nearly suffocated Daphne's eyes were intoxicated, and she finally gently pushed Shea away. Panting softly, she rebuked, Are you always so rough?" Shea smiled, but did not say anything. Daphne shrank back, then hugged the leather robe and sat up. Her beautiful neck and snow-white shoulders were exposed to the air, causing Shea's eyes to become intoxicated. The woman seemed to enjoy the loving gaze of the man she loved. Smiling, she leaned over and gently kissed Shea's cheek. Then, she stood up, wrapped herself in the leather robe, and stepped barefoot on the grass. Carefully, step by step, she walked toward the stream. Her snow-white toes probed the cool stream water. Then, Daphne turned around and smiled at Shea. Her smile finally became more cheerful, carrying with it the charm and playfulness of a girl. She even stuck out her tongue and made a funny face, begging, I want to wash, can you turn around?" Shea laughed, but shamelessly shook his head and said loudly, "No." Daphne looked troubled. "I beg you, Shea, no." Shea shook his head resolutely before saying something even more shameless. "I want to look at you." Daphne's face turned even redder and she glared at Shea. However, Shea did not show any intention of avoiding her. Instead, he sat there boldly, his eyes wide open. There was a look of greed in his eyes as he stared at Daphne's body. Daphne sighed helplessly. Under Shea's gaze, despite her shyness, she was finally moved by the look in her lover's eyes. Thus, she agreed to Shea's shameless request. Biting her lips, she finally gently lifted the leather robe covering her body, exposing her beautiful naked body to the air and the morning sun. Of course, she was also exposed to the eyes of her lover. Early in the morning, she stood naked beside the clear stream. Her near-perfect body was like that of a goddess. Step by step, she slowly stepped into the water. Under Shea's greedy gaze, Daphne suppressed the shyness in her heart and allowed her lover's gaze to sweep over her body. In the end, she could no longer resist the shyness in her heart. With a swoosh, her body sank deep into the water. She turned around and said in a displeased tone, Have you seen enough?" Shea, however, took a deep breath and stood up. Then, he strode towards the stream and threw himself into the water in an almost rude and unreasonable manner. Then, he hugged Daphne tightly in his arms and whispered in her ear, "Not enough, I can't see enough, I can never see enough." After saying that, his strong and powerful arms tightened and he lifted the woman out of the water. Daphne cried out in surprise, but she immediately realized the man's true intention. Her face flushed red, but her eyes were filled with a thick tenderness that could not be dissipated. She obediently allowed her body to be held by the man, her arms hooking around Shea's neck. Shea gently placed Daphne on the bank of the stream, and then gently lay down next to the stream. In the morning, the man's panting and the woman's soft moans could be heard again. Unlike last night's storm-like chaos, this morning's storm was actually gentle. From beginning to end, Shea's every movement was filled with tenderness and affection that Daphne could clearly feel, as though he was trying to make up for last night's rudeness. By the time this pair of man and woman who were immersed in bliss finally ended the morning's passion and finished washing up, the sun was already hanging above their heads. Daphne's limp body nestled in Shea's arms, seemingly drained of all strength. Her head rested on Shea's chest as she whispered, "This forest is very beautiful, can we stay here for a while?" Shea smiled gently and took a deep breath into Daphne's hair. Then, he said softly, "All right. You can stay here for as long as you want." "No need, it won't take long. One day will be enough." Daphne raised her head to look at the sky and spread open her fingers. Under the sunlight, her slender and fair fingers appeared transparent. A faint trace of melancholy flashed across the young woman's eyes. "Shea, do you love me?" Shea nodded without hesitation. "Really? Really?" Then, Daphne stared intently at Shea. "Will you be willing to do anything for me, agree to any request of mine?" Shea hesitated for a moment and Daphne quickly said, "Oh, I don't want to talk about Adeline, I promise." Shea nodded deeply. "I will be willing to do anything for you, agree to any request of yours. Are you not afraid that I will ask you to give up on Adeline and choose me?" Daphne looked at Shea. Shea smiled and his large, rough hand cupped Daphne's delicate face. "I know you are not that kind of woman. That is why I believe you." Daphne appeared to be smiling. "Remember what you just said. You will agree to any request of mine, do anything for me." The two of them stayed in the forest for an entire day. Daphne's reason was that the forest was very beautiful. In truth, it was a very bad reason. This was just an ordinary mountain forest. There was nothing special about it. However, if Daphne wanted to stay here, Shea would not refuse her. Truth be told, in the eyes of a man and a woman who had just fallen in love, this was the time to be sweet. Forget the fact that there were mountains and rivers here, even if they were in the wilderness or in the middle of a desert. In their current state of mind, it would be a paradise on earth. The day passed quickly and the two of them spent the entire afternoon hugging each other as they sat beside the stream. Daphne softly told Shea about various interesting things that happened when she was young, the first time she wore a beautiful dress, the butterflies she caught in the courtyard of her home, the things she used to cry about. Listening to these little girls' trivial matters, Shea didn't have the slightest bit of impatience. As long as Daphne was willing to talk, he was willing to sit on the side, holding her soft and slender waist, and quietly listening. When the sun gradually set, Daphne looked at the afterglow of the setting sun and a trace of sadness appeared in her eyes. She abruptly turned her head to look at Shea and gave a faint sigh. This day passed so quickly. There are still many days to come. Shea smiled. Returning to the campfire, the two of them lay down in each other's arms. What surprised Xiao was that this night, Daphne's performance was exceptionally passionate. Normally, the first time between a man and a woman was the hottest thing in the world. However, Daphne's passion shocked Shea. Throughout the night, in Shea's arms, this woman had seemingly abandoned her usual graceful and dignified demeanor. It was as though she had transformed into a little wild cat, incessantly clawing and biting, using nearly all of her passion to tease Shea and cater to his every thrust. It was as though she knew no exhaustion, as though she wanted to vent all of her passion in this one night. Truth be told, for a girl like her, she was very inexperienced in this aspect. Her teasing techniques were also unfamiliar and even somewhat laughable. However, in Shea's eyes, as long as there was love, he would naturally find this woman in his arms to be incomparably beautiful. Even those somewhat inexperienced and laughable teasing, in Shea's eyes, were filled with love. For a woman to be willing to go to such an extent in order to please her man, what more could a man ask for? It was not until the latter half of the night that Shea had forgotten how many spring winds there were that the woman in his arms finally became exhausted. Her body weakly rested in his arms. It was as though all the bones in her body had turned limp, transforming into a pool of spring water. Daphne was truly exhausted. She was so exhausted that she could not even move a finger. However, her body was still tightly wrapped around Shea like an octopus. Even when she finally fell asleep, her hands were still tightly wrapped around Shea's neck. A night of entanglement should have been blissful and warm, but this passion contained a faint taste of despair. Finally, when the sky brightened again, even though Shea's body was strong, but in this kind of thing, in terms of physical exhaustion, men were naturally at a disadvantage compared to women. Even though Shea's body was made of iron, Shea was finally a little tired after Daphne's almost desperate frenzy last night. He slept very soundly. When he woke up, he found that Daphne had opened her eyes at some point and was quietly looking at him. Shea smiled and was about to say something when Daphne in his arms suddenly spoke. Her tone of voice suddenly lost the intimacy and deep love that they had yesterday morning. Although it was just one word, Shea was able to sense something unusual about it. Daphne then sat up. Under Shea's watchful gaze, she quietly put on her clothes. After putting on her clothes, she combed her hair and turned around. At that moment, although she was still smiling, that smile had seemingly returned to her usual graceful and dignified self, the Empress of the Empire. "General Shea, please escort me back." "Shea? General?" Shea's face froze. What did she call me? General? Shea frowned and reached out with his hand to pull Daphne up. However, Daphne suddenly took a step back, avoiding Shea's hand. The smile on her face gradually disappeared and she said softly, "General Shea, it is getting late. I'll have to trouble you to escort me back." "What is it?" Shea stood up after putting on his clothes. "What did you call me?" "General Shea." Daphne gritted her teeth and took a deep breath. There was a faint tremor in her voice as she said, "I said it before. I don't want much, not for the future, not for the rest of my life. Yesterday was enough. The happiness of that day is over, and now I have forgotten all about it." Her voice trembled, but she was resolute. The two looked at each other for a moment. Shea shouted angrily, "Are you crazy?" He tried to go over, but Daphne suddenly pulled out a dagger. The gleaming blade was right on her own delicate neck. She took a deep breath, her face was cold, and even her voice was cold. "General Shea, please escort me back." Shea's body stiffened as he stared at Daphne. Are you crazy? Have you suddenly become a different person? Are you not the Daphne I know?" He still wanted to reach out for the dagger. Daphne quickly shrank back again. "I'm not crazy. I'm Daphne. I'm the daughter of the Minas family. I'm also the Empress of the Empire." Daphne's eyes were filled with tears, but her face was still cold. General Shea, please, carry out my orders. Shea suddenly roared angrily and rushed up. He snatched the dagger from Daphne's hand and threw it on the ground. Then he violently pulled the woman into his arms. But the woman in his arms, her body was still so enchanting, but there was no longer the lingering and warmth of yesterday. Shea could clearly feel that Daphne's body was stiff and cold. General Shea, are you still not satisfied? Daphne sneered. Do you want one more time? Or do you want to taste me again? I can promise you that I'll satisfy you. But after I satisfy you, please also agree to my request. With that, she suddenly pulled open her clothes, revealing her white shoulders. She looked coldly at Shea. You want it? Then bring it on, I'll satisfy you. Shea was infuriated. However, in the face of Daphne's cold expression, he did not know where to direct his anger. He roared out furiously and suddenly turned around to punch a large tree. The large tree collapsed with a loud bang, sending wood chips flying everywhere. Shea glared fiercely at Daphne. Why? Tell me why. Why are you doing this? Daphne did not answer. She simply stared coldly at Shea. After a while, Shea suddenly clenched his fists and looked at Daphne. Enough. Put on your clothes. Damn it. Yesterday, this woman had been clinging onto him affectionately. At this moment, however, she had suddenly displayed such a cold attitude. Shea's heart was abruptly filled with rage. I know what you're trying to do. I also know what you're trying to do. You're crazy. You're crazier than any crazy woman. Shea took one step at a time toward Daphne, his eyes filled with rage. Do you want to do this? Is that so? Seeing the rage in Shea's eyes, Daphne's heart suddenly softened. Her voice trembled. You promised me. You will agree to any of my requests, do anything for me, Shea did not say anything. I am the daughter of the Minas family. The fate of someone like me is something you will never understand, Shea, Daphne said softly. Yesterday was already the greatest happiness of my life. I've tasted it, and my wish has been fulfilled. That's enough. I've lived for myself. Although it was only for a short day, I've already experienced such a feeling. Thank you sorry. Shea finally raised his head to look at Daphne, his eyes turning cold. Enough. He took a deep breath. Put on your clothes. Let's go. Empress. Your Highness. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 536. GOR Chapter 493. Up north, down south. In fact, after the ambush and the loss of the Queen, Stephen did not completely collapse like Shea had expected. After all, although he was a mediocre person, he was at least from the central army of the Empire. He had experienced Odin's invasion of the south and the annihilation of the 7th Division's main force by Odin's Scarlet Snow Army. He had followed the remnants of the army and encountered the most dangerous situation. Therefore, after the ambush and the loss of the Queen, Stephen, who had suffered a huge blow, was dispirited for a night. Before dawn, he had already pulled himself together. Even though his eyes were filled with despair and ruthlessness, he was still able to control himself. Gather all the cavalry and spread out. Search along the river. Stephen gritted his teeth. He had already felt the strangeness of this ambush. He had just gone to the burning forest. Although the fire had been extinguished, from the traces left behind, there wasn't a large group of people lying in ambush. From the horseshoe prints outside the forest, there were very few horseshoe prints. It was very likely that there were only a few people who ambushed him, or even just one. The enemy actually dared to ambush a group of more than 1,000 people here alone. In the dark night, while he was crossing the river, they set the forest on fire and then attacked with arrows to confuse him. As for the arrows that flew out from the forest, they were all checked. There were some things left in the forest. Some small crossbows were set up on the branches of some trees, and were all connected with thin iron chains. Obviously, the enemy did not have many people. When they ambushed him, the dense rain of arrows was just an illusion created by the enemy using this kind of mechanism. If there were more than 10 crossbows connected with ropes, the arrows would be loaded. Then, as long as the control rope was pulled, more than 10 arrows would be fired at the same time. Moreover, from the looks of the arrows that were later picked up by the river bank, the arrowheads were all blunted. Obviously, the enemy's intention was to confuse and not to kill. From the various traces, the enemy was definitely not a local rebel force. They were more like lone bandits that roamed the wilderness. What made Stephen feel humiliated was that during the ambush, there were deserters among the cavalry under his command. Tens of them deserted, but in the end, they were all chased back by the elite horse bandit cavalry. Stephen's face burned as he looked at the tied-up deserters on the ground. He was very clear about the origin of the 100 elite cavalry. These regular soldiers had always looked down on his second-rate garrison soldiers. This made him feel even more humiliated. One had to know that he, Lord Stephen, used to be a member of the Central Army of the Empire, a real regular army. Furious, he immediately wanted to give the order to execute the deserters. However, the 100-horse bandit cavalry soldiers refused to carry out the order. Stephen, who had nowhere to vent his anger, could only whip the deserters with his own hands. The teams that were sent out to search for Stephen ran outside for a day and a night. The people who came back one after another brought back disappointing news. Finally, the last bit of hope in Stephen's heart was wiped out. One of the teams was the closest to success. They tracked down Shea's horse hoof prints. Unfortunately, the horse hoof prints disappeared after entering a forest and passing through a small muddy swamp area. After that, there was a vast forest that stretched out for dozens of miles. To search such a large forest, even if tens of thousands of people were mobilized to seal the mountain and search, it would take at least a few months. Moreover, he only had 1,000 men under his command, and this was an area occupied by the enemy. The queen could not be found. Stephen finally had to face this fact in his heart. Then, he began to rack his brains to think of a way out for himself. He was very reluctant to return to the northern garrison area. He had been unable to integrate into the northern garrison area. Apparently, General Shea did not like him, a Central Army officer with a background from the imperial capital. More importantly, he had lost the queen, which meant that his mission had failed. When he returned, General Shea Thunder would have enough reason to punish him. Not to mention other things, just the fact that he had lost the queen was enough to hang him. If it were any other trusted general of Shea Thunder, perhaps he would be lenient. But he would not receive that kind of treatment. Even if he was not stupid, at least he knew that General Shea Thunder had been working hard to dilute the mark of the Central Army in the Northern Army ever since the establishment of the Northern Army. He would definitely not let go of such a dignified opportunity to wipe out an old member of the Central Army like himself. As for going to Osgilla, this idea was very tempting in Stephen's mind. He was already here and out of the Northern Army's sphere of influence. If he continued to go south, there was a great chance that he could return to the imperial capital. But if he lost the queen, he would still be sentenced to death. Going back to the north would mean death. Going to the imperial capital would also mean death. Stephen grabbed his hair anxiously. In desperation, he came up with a last resort. Going back to the imperial capital, but he had to bring this army back. Although Stephen's talent was average, he was born in a noble family and his vision was naturally not ordinary. He was very clear that in troubled times, whoever had the most military power would have the most power. Now, the imperial capital was preparing for a counterattack against the rebels. But the power of the royal family had been greatly weakened after the rebellion and the invasion of the Odin people. Even General Adrik had to transfer some second or even third-line local garrison troops from the south of the empire. They were a group of farmers who had only received a little bit of the most basic military training and hurriedly picked up weapons. The lack of military power, especially the lack of military power, was the biggest weakness of the imperial capital. If I can bring this army of 1,000 people to the imperial capital, then I'll have an army to protect myself. Plus, with the help of the clans in the imperial capital, I might be able to find a way out by pulling some strings. At worst, even if he was transferred to the south and returned to his family's territory to be an official, that would also be a way out. If it was 1 or 2 years ago, an army of over 1,000 people would not be qualified to negotiate with the imperial capital. But now the military power in the imperial capital was tight. Previously, when Shea Thunder went to the south to rescue the emperor, he only brought 3,000 cavalrymen, and it shocked the nobles in the imperial capital into not daring to act rashly. His army had 1,500 people, including 500 cavalrymen. It should not be too difficult to protect his life with the army as a bargaining chip and reliance. Stephen looked at the infantry resting by the river with a gloomy look. The troops were full of uneasiness. The soldiers were not fools. Losing the Empress meant that the mission was a complete failure. How could anyone with a brain not understand what a big crime it was to lose the Empress? Moreover, they had been ambushed last night. Now, the troops were not advancing or retreating. They were still resting and looking around. Were they not afraid that the local rebels would hear the news and send troops to encircle them? From the officers to the soldiers, almost everyone's eyes were full of anxiety and fear. The only thing that seemed a little different was the 100 elite cavalrymen who used to be bandit. The crime of losing the Empress was a big crime. If it happened to others, they might be afraid. But for these unruly bandits, it was nothing. In the hearts of the bandits, even if they had surrendered to the government and been incorporated into the regular army of the northern part of the empire, the banditry in their bones could not be erased in such a short time. In the eyes of the bandits, the heavens were the most important in the world. Shea and Miss Nene were the second most important. The rest of the people were King nothing. What Empress? What? Losing the Empress was just a woman. This mission was really a bit inexplicable. Everyone had worked hard to come here. In order to escort a woman, it was fine. But last night's night attack was too humiliating in the hearts of these elite cavalrymen. If it was not for Commander Stephen, who was too stupid and rash all the way, would they have been ambushed? Moreover, the soldiers under his command were too useless. The hundreds of people who crossed the river were caught off guard by the enemy's ambush. They could not even resist, and the Empress was taken away in confusion. They were simply useless. But this was also good. The mission was over. Next, they could just pack up and turn back to their hometown in the north. There was no point in staying here. Unlike Stephen, who still had fantasies, these bandits were used to this kind of ambush and robbery business. In the eyes of these veterans, they were well aware of the incident last night. There was definitely someone who had calculated the route of their team and specifically waited at the bank of the Agate River to prepare for an ambush. Moreover, their team was too useless. The commander was also a mediocre person. There was no need to think about the ending at all. This Stephen still wanted to stay here and send people to search around. It was simply a waste of time. These bandits who used to specialize in this business were all veterans who were proficient in this. In this business, the most important thing was to swarm up and disperse in a hubbub. After they succeeded, they would immediately flee 1,000 miles away and then lay dormant. Don't even think about getting a single strand of hair. Until the wind blows over, these guys will definitely not show their faces. Moreover, since they had carefully prepared this ambush, naturally they had already arranged a way out. Once they succeeded, they would immediately retreat safely. Stephen had sent people out to search blindly like a housefly. It would be a miracle if he could find them. Since this was the case, they should hurry back to report on their mission. Anyway, these bandits were not afraid of being punished when they returned. The commander of this trip was Stephen, so he would naturally take the blame. Moreover, who were they? They were the direct subordinates of Shea's son-in-law. They were the old subordinates who followed Miss Nei. They were the first group of people who came to join the Northern Army when it was just established. No matter what, the son-in-law would not side with outsiders. In this way, the bandits waited patiently for a day. It was not until the next night, when all the search teams returned, that they finally made a request to Stephen. "What? We still want to go to the capital?" Several of the cavalry officers of the bandits shouted in unison when they heard Stephen's words after negotiating with him. At that time, a bandit leader shouted, "Are you out of your mind? Go to the capital? We are the Northern Army. Since the mission has failed and this matter is over, we naturally have to go back to the north. What kind of capital are we going to?" Stephen's face was livid. He slowly said in a deep voice, "We are escorting Her Highness back to the capital. If we lose Her Highness halfway, the mission will not be considered completed. We have to go to the capital to report, then we can organize an army to rescue Her Highness. How can we go back to Denzel City?" The bandits could not take it anymore and started to clamor. Some directly pointed at Stephen's nose and scolded, "If you want to rescue Her Highness, then you can go by yourself. Lao Tzu and the rest don't have the time to accompany you. This is the territory of the damn rebels. If Her Highness is gone, how can we rescue her? If you have the ability, let the capital send 100,000 troops to wipe out the rebels and rescue Her Highness. We only have 1,000 people, we have no interest in this kind of thing." Stephen's face was gloomy, but his hand was already on the hilt of his sword. He shouted coldly, "I am the commander of this trip. My words are military orders. Now that the mission has not been completed, we cannot go back. If we cannot rescue Her Highness back to the capital, no one is allowed to leave. Otherwise, we will treat you as deserters. Pass down my orders, all troops move out and continue south. Report the situation here to the capital and organize a rescue." "Damn you!" one of the bandits spat out fiercely. Then, he raised a finger at Stephen in disdain, or the middle finger. A murderous look appeared on Stephen's face. He had made some preparations. If he wanted to continue leading these troops south, these mounted soldiers who were not under his command would be the biggest obstacle. As for the other 1,000+ men, they were all under his command. Naturally, some of them were his trusted subordinate. However, these 100 mounted soldiers were not his subordinate. They were all elites who were loyal to Shea. If they were to refuse to go to the capital, he would not be able to command them. If that were to happen, he would have no choice but to. It was only a few horse bandit cavalry officers who came to negotiate with Stephen. However, Stephen had many trusted subordinates around him. Seeing that their general was quarreling with these cavalry officers, some of them had already nervously gathered around with their hands on their sword hilts. Stephen took a deep breath and was about to make the first move. After all, he was the highest commander of this trip. As long as he made the first move and accused these disobedient cavalry officers of being deserters, he would use his status as the commander to forcefully suppress them with military orders. In the Northern Army, military orders were highly valued. The crime of deserters had always been the most serious. At that time, as long as he used this excuse, he would order his troops to take down these cavalry officers and seize their weapons. If he was more ruthless, he would directly kill them on the spot. At that time, he would have military orders, the status of the commander, and the power to kill to establish his authority. He believed that these cavalry officers would not dare to act rashly and would obediently listen to him, seeing the murderous look in Stephen's eyes, Which of these elite mounted bandits had not been through mountains of corpses and seas of blood? Looking at the other party's eyes and the people around them who were approaching, how could they not know that the other party was up to no good? However, these mounted bandits were fearless. They were a group of daring fellows. Among these mounted bandits and cavalry officers, which one of them was a good person? Without waiting for Stephen to speak, a few of the officers looked at each other. Without even shouting, a few of them had already pulled out their sabers. A few of the officers rushed up and actually cooperated with each other very well. On each side, 2 of them held their sabers horizontally to block the surrounding soldiers. The 2 in the middle, who were the best in martial arts, directly pounced on Stephen. Stephen's martial arts were naturally not inferior. Seeing that the other party was about to attack, he immediately slashed with his saber horizontally. However, these mounted bandits were all valiant and cunning. They were very familiar with this kind of close combat work. Before Stephen's saber reached them, they directly lowered their bodies and fell to the ground. They hugged Stephen's leg, and the saber in their hands unceremoniously greeted Stephen's leg. Another standing bandit waved his saber to block Stephen's saber. He was still laughing and shouting, "Sir, if you have something to say, let's talk nicely. We are all brothers, there is no need to use weapons." As he laughed and shouted, Stephen's subordinates were stunned. However, the saber in this mounted bandit's hand was not slow at all. He slashed over one saber after another. Stephen had already screamed and collapsed in a pool of blood. His thigh was stabbed and he fell to the ground. Another mounted bandit had already pounced on him and held him down. A short saber was directly stabbed under his ribs. As he stabbed, he laughed and said, "Sir, why can't you stand properly? Come, quickly help sir to sit properly." Stephen's mouth was already spitting out blood. He howled, but his mouth was already covered tightly. Then, he felt a chill on his neck. A mounted bandit had already cut his neck with a saber. He held the head and jumped up. There was no longer any trace of the smile on his face. Holding the bloody head high, this mounted bandit shouted sternly, "Stephen has betrayed the enemy for fear of punishment. He has been executed. The rest of you, put down your weapons and follow suit. Those who disobey will be killed." After all, this was only a second-line garrison force. Most of them were even soldiers who had been eliminated, who would be willing to fight with their lives on the line. Even though Stephen had a few trusted subordinates, these horse bandit officers were too ferocious. Before Stephen could make a move, they had already taken the initiative to attack. Their attacks were ruthless, and they killed Stephen in a single move. Even if those trusted subordinates were usually very loyal to Stephen, now that their boss's head had been cut off, how could they still resist stubbornly? After a slight hesitation, someone directly threw away the weapon in his hand and knelt down with his hands covering his head. With someone taking the lead, the rest who were holding weapons also helplessly threw away their weapons. A few mounted bandits went over and kicked them to the ground one by one. Then, the leader of the mounted bandit cavalry jumped onto the back of a horse and stood there. He took out a sealed sheepskin envelope and tore it open. He read it out loud, "By the secret order of the General's Mansion of the Garrison Army, Sergeant Laquin, an officer of the 3rd Cavalry Troop of the Garrison Independent Cavalry Regiment, is hereby authorized to follow the Army south as an escort. Sergeant Laquin is authorized to make decisions on the spot and act as he sees fit. When necessary, he can take over the command and control the entire army. Those who disobey will be punished according to military law. Signed by the General's Mansion of the Garrison Army, on the X day of the X month." This secret order was obtained before the departure. In fact, although this mounted bandit had not opened it, before the departure, Shea had received him and told the contents of the order to this mounted bandit officer. In fact, this officer was illiterate. If he were to read the order himself, he would not be able to recognize a single word. At this critical moment, He took out the order to read it out, took over the command, and killed Stephen decisively. The entire army was immediately convinced. No one expressed any dissent. After all, these cavalry were from the 1st Cavalry Independent Cavalry Regiment of the garrison army. Everyone knew that this was the most direct line of command of General Shea in the Northern Army of the garrison army. As for this horse gang officer, when he was reading out the order, he even held the military order upside down. Naturally, no one noticed such a harmless detail. After killing Stephen and successfully taking over the command, these mounted bandits were no longer interested in staying here. They immediately ordered the entire army to set off and cross the river again to return north. More than 1,000 people returned the way they came. They returned to the north of the Agate River. But in less than a day's time on the road, they suddenly heard the faint sound of horse hooves coming from the distance of the road. The expressions of the few mounted bandits and cavalrymen instantly became tense. After all, this was still an enemy-occupied area. If the local rebel army came to pursue them, they were afraid that even if the cavalry could not beat them, they could still run. But these infantrymen, they were afraid. The mounted bandits immediately ordered the army to stay away from the formation and prepare for battle. Fortunately, the sound of horse hooves thundered in the distance. Looking at the flying dust, the mounted bandits only breathed a sigh of relief when they saw the raised flag opposite them. Instead, it was replaced by a look of surprise. The cavalry that came like thunder was carrying the flag of the 1st Cavalry Independent Cavalry Regiment of the Northern Garrison Army. This cavalry troop of 2,000 came from the northeast. Their formation was majestic and solemn. Obviously, they were the most elite cavalry troop. The leader was a majestic cavalry general, sitting on the back of a horse. His body was tall and sturdy, and he was wearing the Chio Shan armor of the senior general office. There was a war hammer hanging on the saddle, and the iron helmet covering his face was pulled up, revealing a well-defined square face. It was Sharba. Sharba had led the 2,000 mounted soldiers and escorts out of Denzel City. They had parted ways back in the new city. Sharba was nominally leading the army to quell the rebellion in the Corsica region. Unexpectedly, he had come here to provide support. When the two armies met up, Sharba was shocked to hear that the Empress had gone missing. He was not one of those mounted bandits. Instead, he was a member of the Roadrear Cavalry. He could be considered a member of the regular army. Naturally, he knew how important the Empress' identity was. However, he did not have the authority to make a decision on this matter. Shea had given him the order to pretend to lead the army to quell the rebellion in the Corsica region. In fact, he was to secretly lead the cavalry south. He was to lead the army along the north bank of the Agate River and be ready to provide support to the escorts in the north. This trip was not very dangerous. Sharba had brought 2,000 elite cavalrymen from the north. Although this was already the territory of the rebels, with 2,000 cavalrymen in hand, unless the leader of the rebels was crazy, he would not dare to provoke such a ferocious army. If 2,000 elite cavalrymen were to fight in the wilderness, they would not be able to find a match within 1,000 miles. The only difficulty was that if they wanted to provide support to the escorts in the south, they would have to pass through the territory of the Besta people. Sharba had received Shea's secret order, so he had no choice but to announce that he was going to quell the rebellion in the Corsica region. In fact, the army had turned back halfway. Then, they had quietly sneaked into the territory of the Besta people. Then, the army rushed south and passed through the Besta people's territory. As for the matter of the Besta people discovering that the northern army had rashly entered their territory, naturally, the higher-ups of the garrison area would argue with the Besta people about it. When the two sides met, Sharba listened to the horse bandit officers talk about what had happened. When he heard that they had killed Stephen and seized command, Sharba only raised his eyebrows and sneered. South? If that bastard wanted to go to the capital, He could have gone by himself, but he had the idea of bringing an army south to seek refuge in the capital. That was a betrayal of our northern army. Well killed. Pausing for a moment, he then told these mounted bandit officers, "I'm here to receive you under the command of General Shi. The general has ordered me to bring all 1,500 of you back to Denzel City." Just as Sharba's cavalrymen and the escorts met in the evening, from the south bank of the Agate River came galloping from the east. Shea on horseback had a grave and gloomy expression. Behind him, Daphne just gently hugged Shea's waist, her beautiful hair fluttering in the wind. A galloping horse, a mighty knight, and a stunning beauty. Such a scene should have been beautiful under the setting sun, but at this moment, the two people on horseback both had cold and gloomy expressions on their faces. They rode to the riverside, which was the place of the ambush the night before. Shea looked around. There were still traces of the army stationed here, but the men and horses were nowhere to be seen. He rode around the area again to make sure that there were no traces of the men and horses going south. He was sure of one thing: the escorts must have crossed the river and returned north. "We're late," Shea said lightly. "The escorts can't find you. Now they must have followed the secret order I left and returned." Daphne sat on horseback and sighed faintly. "You arranged all this long ago, didn't you?" Shea raised his eyebrows. "Of course. Even if it was to save you, I can't just give up 1,500 men and horses. I've already made arrangements. Once I save you, the men left in the army will use my orders to take over the army and lead them back north." Pausing, Shea hesitated for a moment before saying in a low voice, "I didn't think about sending you back after saving you." Those words were cold and hard. Hearing those words, Daphne's heart ached and she could not help but whisper, "Shea, no need to say anything," Shea said coolly. "There's no need to mention anything about the responsibility of the family. I promised you that no matter what request you have, I will fulfill it." Daphne's heart trembled and she felt so pained that she could hardly breathe. She gently pressed one hand against her chest and forced herself to speak. "But now, what should we do without the escorts? How do I return to the imperial capital?" Shea was silent for a moment. Then, he suddenly turned his head. His pair of eyes were frighteningly bright as he stared intently at Daphne. Taking a deep breath, he said, "Daphne, I will ask you one more time, have you really made up your mind to return to the imperial capital? Even if I ask you to stay, you won't be willing?" Being stared at by Shea's bright eyes, Daphne felt her blood boil and she nearly blurted out, "I am willing! I am willing! I am willing to stay by your side forever." However, those words were just about to leave her mouth when she quickly swallowed them back down. Daphne looked straight into Shea's eyes and said nothing for a long time. Seeing that Daphne was just looking at him without saying anything, Shea's bright eyes finally gradually dimmed. He turned his head, his chest heaving up and down. His breathing was hurried and his mood was agitated. After taking a few deep breaths, he was barely able to suppress the resentment in his heart. Then, Shea tightened his grip on the reins. After a while, he slowly released his grip. "If that is the case, I will personally send you back to the imperial capital." Regarding the plot between Shea and Daphne, let me say something here. I know that many readers have very weak hearts and cannot bear to see the slightest bit of conflict and repetition. However, allow me to make a small argument here. Even if it is a harem, there must be some technical content. Some repetition and processes are essential. At any rate, this is an online YY novel. Naturally, it is impossible for there to be a plot that would make everyone unhappy. In my own process of creating the characters, I believe that if she were to immediately abandon everything and follow Shea, that would not be the character of Daphne. Someone like the poor thing could do something like that. However, if it were Daphne, it would be a different situation. A woman who has been shaped as a political marriage tool from a young age, shouldering the responsibility of her family. Even when her husband was a rabbit and had the intention to kill her, she was still willing to endure humiliation for several years. It is impossible for her mind to suddenly change. Giving herself to Shea is already the biggest change that a woman like Daphne can make in a short period of time. It is also the biggest and most outrageous thing that she can do. To immediately abandon everything is not in line with the character's creation. Of course, I am not deliberately spilling dog blood to create sadness. This plot is naturally to serve the overall plot. In the end, Daphne will definitely be a country bumpkin. There is no doubt about that. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 537. 7,000-word chapter. GOR Chapter 494. The situation in the imperial capital. Shea himself was very clear that as the leader of a group, he really didn't have the consciousness of responsibility. He was determined to personally send Daphne back to the imperial capital. Trekking all the way to the imperial capital was a long and arduous journey that took a lot of time. Currently, the entire northern garrison region was filled with all sorts of military and political affairs, including a large amount of official affairs regarding the relocation of the governing area, waiting for him to deal with. Yet, he left just like that, when he was considering sending someone to the imperial capital to inform Adric of Hastings's movements. He had thought about it for a long time. But now, he had to personally make a trip to the imperial capital. If I had known, I would have made the trip myself. Shea sighed inwardly. Although he was accompanied by a stunning beauty like Daphne, and the two of them had experienced such an intimate relationship, the journey was not pleasant and there was not the slightest hint of romance. Although the two of them rode on the same horse all the way south from the Agate River, they seemed to have fallen into tacit silence along the way. Daphne did not speak, and Shea did not want to speak either. Such a cold atmosphere was like an invisible wall between a man and a woman. Since they were traveling on light horses, their speed was naturally much faster than a large group of people. After leaving the Agate River, Shea did his best to choose secluded paths to avoid trouble. The two of them also avoided staying in towns and cities. Most of the time, they would rather sleep in the wilderness. A bonfire, simple food, it was just like the gentle scenery by the stream in the forest, but the atmosphere was not like that anymore. Daphne's attitude towards Shea was deliberately cold, and she kept a distance from Shea. She would always refer to him as General Shea. Although Shea understood Daphne's intentions and was also very clear that this woman made such a choice for the sake of her family's responsibility, but, as a young man who really didn't have much experience in relationships, when faced with such a complicated emotional entanglement, it was very difficult for him to remain rational. Although he was all-powerful, although he had a powerful army in his hands, although he was already a tyrant of this era, in the end, he was still a young man in his early 20s. He had no experience in dealing with matters of the heart. In the face of this cold war between the two of them, he could only remain silent. Although he understood Daphne's difficulties logically, he could not accept it emotionally, could not tolerate it, and could not let it go. This woman, damn it! How could she treat me like this? Shea was filled with resentment like any young man who had tasted the bitterness of love for the first time. Actually, if you really don't want her to leave, you can just take her back directly. Tie her to a horse with a rope and head north. She'll be back to your territory in a few days. She's a weak woman, do you think she can resist you? Dora was somewhat disdainful of Shea's cowardly actions. Shea was annoyed and said coldly, "What do you know? Since she can be so heartless, do you want me to tie her back by force? Shouldn't this kind of thing be consensual?" Since she's heartless, why should I beg her? Humph, Lao Tzu is a man, don't you have dignity? When Dora heard this, she laughed disdainfully and only said one sentence, "Stupid brat, both of you are just as stupid. Between a man and a woman, there's no reason to be angry. What dignity, it's just that you can't let go of your face and airs. What does a dragon like you know?" Shea immediately retorted. Dora didn't say anything else. Shea was extremely annoyed by Daphne calling him General Shea, and in his anger, he simply addressed her as Your Highness the Empress. The two lovers who had once been so sweet and intimate with each other naked, for a moment there was a kind of ridiculous feeling of courtesy between the monarch and the minister. How could Daphne not understand Shea's anger? She saw the pain and anger in Shea's eyes every day, and her heart was filled with emotions. She didn't know how many times she wanted to throw herself into Shea's arms, but she forced herself to hold back. She was very clear that it wasn't easy for her to make up her mind. If she became weak again, she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to harden her heart. On one side, it was the man she loved deeply for the first time in her life, but on the other side, it was her father and brothers, and the heavy Mina's family name. In order to maintain the status of the family, to maintain the family's honor, the Mina's family needed an empress, not a woman who had gone missing for unknown reasons. The Mina's family needed an empress. Even if it was an empress who died in the capital, she must not disappear without a reason. Even if she had to die, she wanted to die in the imperial capital as an empress. She wanted to die with dignity. Perhaps this was her only value, although Shea's face was cold. He was, after all, a man who was tough on the outside but soft on the inside. Although he was full of anger, he still took great care of Daphne. In his heart, he had already regarded Daphne as his woman. Along the way, Daphne could naturally feel Shea's meticulous care in all aspects. Regarding food and lodging, this man took meticulous care of her. Even knowing that her body was weak, if they slept outdoors, he would stay up all night, watching over the bonfire without extinguishing it. Every time Daphne woke up, she would find that the man had covered her with his blanket. Several times, she woke up in the middle of the night and looked at Shea's back as he sat by the bonfire. She didn't know how many tears she had shed. At dawn, her eyes were red, but she still tried hard to put on an indifferent look. Although the two were in a cold war, they silently maintained a tacit understanding. Mounts. Although they passed by towns along the way south, neither Shea nor Daphne took the initiative to buy another horse as a mount. The two of them rode together on the same horse, because this was the only chance for the two of them to have intimate contact now. Although in her heart, she hoped that the road to the south would continue like this forever and accompany Shea. Even if they walked on this road for another 100 years and walked to the end of the world, it would still be good. But no matter how far the journey was, there would always be a day when it would be completed. Moreover, the two of them traveled light on the road, without luggage or accompanying carriages and horses, so their speed was much faster. It took them only half a month to reach the military districts of Armenia. This was already the last stop before going to the capital. After passing through the military districts of Armenia, they officially entered the original Ostjila administrative district. Because General Adrik in the capital was preparing for war, the military districts of Armenia had also begun to mobilize and be on alert. In order to prevent spies from the imperial army, the military districts of Armenia were strictly checked. Unfamiliar faces and travelers were strictly checked. But for the powerful Shea, of course, he didn't care. It was a piece of cake to avoid the patrolling soldiers. However, Shea knew that Hughes had seen him before, and Daphne's appearance was too eye-catching. So the two of them simply bypassed the capital of Armenia, Marica, and took a detour to the capital. Although there were checkpoints set up by the rebel army on the way out, at the border of the military districts of Armenia, there were many checkpoints. But with Shea around, avoiding these was not a problem. When they finally made it out of the military districts of Armenia and entered the Ostjila administrative district, Daphne's cold face finally changed. Panic and reluctance began to appear in her eyes. While they were hurrying, she sat on the horse and hugged Shea tightly. Her arms were so strong, it was as though she had used up all the strength in her body. By the time he stopped to rest, Shea could feel that his clothes on his back were wet. If. Shea looked at Daphne and his heart finally softened. He put aside the coldness of the past few days and said in a low voice, "If you regret it now, it's not too late. I'll take you back and get far away from here, okay?" Daphne took a deep breath and looked at Shea. She opened her mouth, but in the end she didn't say a word. Shea waited for a while. Finally, he sighed and silently walked away. The capital was in sight. The two of them knew very well that this should be the last night before reaching the capital. Truth be told, if they did not stop to rest, they would have been able to reach the capital before nightfall. However, the two of them silently agreed to rest. It was as though both Shea and Daphne were looking forward to this last night. After tonight, all of this will be over. After dinner, Daphne sat beside the bonfire, lost in thought. She looked at the bonfire and listened to the crackling sounds of sparks. Daphne's mind was in a daze. Suddenly, her body felt warm as the felt was placed on her shoulder. "Rest early." Shea's voice was terrifyingly low. Daphne gave a soft This time, however, she suddenly reached out to hold Shea's hand that was holding the felt. She gently held it and tilted her head to rest on the back of Shea's hand. Shea's body stiffened and he stood behind the woman without saying anything. "This felt, can you leave it to me?" Daphne whispered. "It has your scent." Shea's heart ached and he nodded. "All right." Even now, the young man still held on to a glimmer of hope, hoping that Daphne would suddenly change her mind. However, after waiting for a long time, Daphne only held his hand and tilted her head. She did not say anything else. Shea took a deep breath and his heart gradually grew cold. He knew that there was no longer any hope of turning things around. "Tomorrow I will send you into the city. However, I cannot directly send you back to the palace. Garcia wants you dead. If you go to the palace without saying anything, I fear that he will secretly kill you. After thinking about it, I can only contact your family first. I know how to find Roddy, your brother Roddy. Then, I will hand you over to him. As for returning to the palace, he will naturally arrange it. When the time comes, your Mina's family will publicly escort you back to the palace and let everyone know. Even if Garcia wants to kill you, he will not dare to do it right now." After saying that, Shea gritted his teeth. "You know very well that going back like this is suicide, right?" "Don't worry." Daphne forced out a smile. "After I return, I will immediately claim to be ill and go home to recuperate. Garcia will have no excuse to refuse this request. When I return home to recuperate, with Roddy and my father protecting me, Garcia will not be able to openly send someone to kill me. I will be careful. After all, my public identity is the Empress of the Empire. Whatever he wants to do, he will have to be careful." "How long will you have to bear this responsibility?" Shea sneered. "Are you going to just wait for him to think of a way to kill you? Are you going to just silently wait for death? Wait until my brother inherits the title of nobility. Wait until my brother ascends to power. Wait until my family's position is stabilized. Then, my mission will be over. At that time, if I am not dead, Shea said indifferently. "Even if you can wait until that day, when your brother ascends to power and you no longer have to support this alone, at that time, you will still be the Empress of the Empire." Daphne's body stiffened. She suddenly turned around and threw herself fiercely into Shea's arms. Shea still wanted to say something, but Daphne's soft and cold lips had already pressed against his mouth. Her lips were cold. "Love me," the woman whispered softly. "This is the last night. Love me well. Next to the bonfire, the two of them finally hugged each other tightly. After a night of passion, at dawn, Daphne lay in Shea's arms. She looked at the rising sun and tears flowed out from the corners of her eyes. Shea gently hugged Daphne and whispered, "Let's go back, okay? I'll take you back." Daphne took a breath and wiped the corners of her eyes. She forced a smile. "Don't say that. You know my determination." She sat up and lifted the blanket covering the two of them. Her naked and beautiful body was exposed to the morning sun. Shea's heart ached and he turned his head away. Daphne turned around and held Shea's face with both hands. She whispered, "Look at me. I want you to look at me. Look at my body. I want you to remember me." Under Shea's gaze, she stood up naked and put on her clothes one by one. She took a comb and quietly combed her golden hair. It was a horn comb which she bought on the way here. At that time, the two of them passed by a small village. Shea did not say much and quietly bought the comb. When he handed it to Daphne, he only said, "I see that you didn't bring a comb. Use this." It was just a crude country product worth only a few copper coins. If such goods were in her own home, even the maids at home would use 100 times better than this. But holding this crude comb, Daphne felt as though she was holding the most precious treasure in the world. She combed her hair quietly and kept the comb close to her bosom. The Duke of Minas's residence in the capital city. The streets outside the Duke's mansion were bustling with noise and excitement. Luxurious carriages were parked by the side of the road. Coachmen wearing bright clothes were sitting in the carriages, waiting quietly. There were also some soldiers who were guarding the carriages, walking back and forth. From the badges on the carriages, each one was more prominent than the other. The carriages were also more luxurious than the last. Outside the Duke's residence, there were many distinguished guests and the streets were crowded. Such a scene would have been a common sight if it had been more than a decade ago. But ever since the late Emperor Cantos began to deliberately weaken the influence of the Minas family in the imperial army and gradually became suspicious of the Duke of Minas, the once prominent Duke of Minas's residence gradually became deserted. When the Duke of Minas finally relinquished his last military post, he finally changed from a marshal who held the military power of the empire to an old nobleman who only held the title of duke. The streets in front of the Minas family's residence had never been so lively. But after the chaos in the capital city, the outside of the Duke of Minas's residence, which had been deserted for many years, finally showed some of its former prosperity. The fate of the times was truly unfathomable. When Emperor Cantos was still alive, the Minas family, which had already declined, was now showing signs of a resurgence under Emperor Garcia's reign. Among the dignitaries in the capital city, who was not an astute official, who was not born with a pair of sharp eyes, who was not an astute person, looking at the current situation in the empire, anyone who was slightly observant could tell that the revival of the Minas family was just around the corner. The army of the empire was now dominated by Adric's family. Although Auderic was an upright and loyal person, and had made great contributions to the empire, he was still a loyal and upright man. But these old foxes in the capital city, who had been immersed in the muddy waters of politics for many years, understood one thing. Adric's family dominating the army was a taboo to the emperor. This was not because Adric's loyalty was unreliable. It was because, as an emperor, no emperor could tolerate such a situation. Even the founding emperor wanted to weaken the military power of the Duke of the Tulip family. No emperor could tolerate the influence of a military chief in the empire's army that was beyond his control. For balance, there must be division. In order to divide Adric's influence in the army, the original plan of the imperial family was to rely on General Span. If Span was still alive, with Span's background in the Imperial Guards and his contributions in the Battle of Osgilla, he would be able to compete with Adric in the army. But Span was dead. He died at the last moment of the battle. This caused the Imperial family's strategy of dividing the army to fail. There were only two ways to reduce Aderic's influence in the army. The first was to trample Aderic's reputation. This was obviously impossible. Now that the empire was facing a national crisis, the empire needed a famous general like Adric to support the collapsing edifice. Moreover, Adric's military service was illustrious and he was loyal and upright. His reputation was excellent. If they were to make a move on him at this time, it would cause a mutiny in the army and a strong backlash. Thus, the only way was to find someone who could be on par with Auderic and divide the current situation in the army. After thinking about it, the only person who had the qualifications and ability to do this was a name: Minas. In terms of qualifications, no matter how illustrious Adric's military service was, compared to the Duke of Minas, he would be overshadowed. The Duke of Minas had spent his life in the military. Almost half of the high-ranking generals in the army were his subordinates or disciples. In terms of military service, the Duke of Minas's military service was illustrious. After decades of military service, the prestige he had built was something that a middle-aged general like Adric could not compare to. Even though the imperial family had neglected him for many years, he was still a tiger. If they wanted to find someone who could compete with Adric, the Minas family was the best candidate. Moreover, in terms of close relationship with the imperial family, the daughter of the Minas family was the real empress. She was the wife of the emperor. She was also part of the imperial family. She was much more intimate than Adric, who was just a general from an external family. The rise of the Minas family was unstoppable. Even Prime Minister Salambanili had entered the palace many times to have secret talks with the Emperor of Garcia. The Prime Minister had suggested to the Emperor many times that the Minas family should be reinstated. Old Prime Minister Salambanili's suggestion was naturally pertinent and in line with the current situation. However, such a reasonable suggestion could not get a clear answer from the Emperor of Garcia. In the Prime Minister's opinion, this was the best way out. Although the Emperor of Garcia was a little extreme, he was not stupid. He should know that this was a good idea. But why was he still unwilling to give in? Salambanili faintly knew about the Emperor's special hobby, and understood that the relationship between the Emperor and the Empress was definitely not good. However, he was a politician. In his opinion, as an emperor, such a small matter should give way to the bigger picture. When the time came, the emperor had to make the decision on what should be done and what should not be done. Whether the relationship between husband and wife was good or bad, in the face of national affairs, it was simply a trivial matter that was not even worth mentioning. That was what Salambanili thought. However, the emperor did not express his opinion, which gave the prime minister a headache. He was also puzzled. It was such a simple matter, and the situation was clear at a glance. What was there to hesitate about? However, the emperor was unwilling to give in. As a prime minister, he could only give many suggestions, but could not force the emperor to make a decision. As time passed, Salambanili could not help but feel dissatisfied. The national affairs were a matter of life and death. How much longer does the emperor want to delay? The nobles in the imperial capital began to walk the path of the Minas family again. For the past few days there were many distinguished guests. The old nobles were busy trying to befriend the old duke, while the new nobles were busy trying to please young Lord Rhodey. For a time, the father and son were very popular in the imperial capital. However, the father and son still kept a low profile. Although there were many guests queuing up to visit them, the old duke always claimed that he was sick and closed his door. Only a powerful elder of the empire was qualified to enter the duke's mansion to have a chat with the old duke. As for the young Lord Rhodey, he was even more decisive. He reported to the military every day. This young Lord Rhodey had a position as a reserve officer of the empire. However, he had always been suppressed by Duke Minas and had never been given a real rank. Reserve officers only reported to the imperial capital on a fixed basis and did some unimportant clerical work. Although Rhodey did not keep a low profile like his father, he rarely made friends with other people. When the nobles in the imperial capital tried to rope him in or invite him to banquets, the young duke used the excuse that he was busy with military affairs as an excuse to decline them. Every day, after the roll call in the imperial capital, he would go home and practice martial arts. The young duke used to lead a dissolute life. However, now, he was living like an ascetic. The more the father and son kept a low profile, the more people believed that the father and son knew that they were on the verge of making a comeback. That was why they deliberately kept a low profile. Prime Minister Salimbonili had also visited the old duke twice. However, the old duke only had small talk with him. As for the old prime minister's probing words about the military affairs, the old duke refused to say anything. He only said that he had retired from the military for many years and was tired of military affairs. He did not want to express any opinions. The old one was slippery while the young one was impenetrable. The emperor also did not express his opinion. This made the old prime minister very frustrated. "Your Majesty, what is he waiting for? What is he thinking?" Every night, when the prime minister returned home, he would sit in his study and think hard. He always had the urge to smash the table. In the prime minister's opinion, the emperor's hesitation was too stupid. If it had been someone with a bad temper, he would have called the emperor a fatuous emperor. However, Salimbonili was the prime minister chosen by the late emperor to be entrusted to him. He was also an important minister of the empire whom Garcia relied on. His fate was firmly tied to the imperial families. Others could scold or be dissatisfied, but he could only endure it silently and think of countermeasures. Salimbonili was more worried about one thing. If he delayed too long, he was afraid that the Minas family would be dissatisfied. The sooner he got the Minas family on his side, the better the situation would be. But now, the whole imperial capital was looking at the Minas family. However, the emperor did not say anything. If the Minas family was dissatisfied after a long time, the situation would not be good. With this thought in mind, the prime minister paid another visit to Duke Minas. He tried to sound him out with words, but the old duke did not show any dissatisfaction. He only talked about the past, showing a leisurely attitude of a man in his twilight years. However, the more relaxed the Duke of Minas was, the more uneasy the prime minister felt. He could not delay any longer. If he delayed any longer and angered the Minas family, the old man would simply wash his hands of this matter. When that time came, where would he find a military figure who could compete with Edric? The prime minister had no choice but to enter the palace again to meet the emperor. This time, Salimbonili made up his mind. When he saw Garcia, he bowed and directly stated his purpose of visit. "Your Majesty, may I ask what you are waiting for?" To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support legal reading. Chapter 538. GOR Chapter 495, Decisiveness to Kill. After so many days of impatience, the Prime Minister could no longer hold it in. His tone became unyielding. Garcia stood on the steps, looking down at the Prime Minister. His eyes were cold. He was not dissatisfied with Salimbonili's attitude. He was not a fool. He knew very well that the Minas family was his only choice. However, this choice was the one he could not make. The reason for this was the Empress. Everyone in the capital knew that he did not like the Empress. However, even someone as close as Salimbonili did not know how bad his relationship with the Empress was. He had once tried to kill Daphne, and Daphne herself seemed to have noticed it. He remembered that when his imperial father was still alive, Daphne had already noticed the assassination attempt at the lake outside the hunting grounds. However, at that time, his imperial father, Emperor Cantos, had used an even more decisive attitude to cover up the matter. At that time, the Empress's maids who knew about it were all killed. Even within the royal guards, there were many people who were directly purged because of this matter. Furthermore, he had received a stern warning from his imperial father. Daphne, she knew. She knew that he wanted to kill her. The relationship between the two had turned into a life-and-death struggle. Under such circumstances, how could he dare to put Daphne's father and brother in an important position? Although that woman had silently tolerated the matter and didn't seem to complain to her father or brother, Lin Mingyao was still in a daze. But that damned Shea had actually released the news of Daphne's assassination attempt. He had ruined his plans. His assassin had not returned for a long time. He was afraid that Shea had already captured him. If the matter was exposed, Shea, the hidden danger in his heart, knew of this secret. It would be a sharp sword hanging over Garcia's head. What angered him the most was that Shea had openly sent people to escort Daphne back to the capital. He had failed several times in his attempts to kill that woman. How could she not hate him? If she came back and told her father and brother, then from then on, his relationship with the Minas family would be severed. There was no need to think about using the Minas family to suppress a Drake. Hence, in Garcia's heart, although using the Minas family was a good move, it was a move that he absolutely could not make. To support a family that hated him, what kind of joke was this? The Grand Chancellor had lost his patience. Garcia took a deep breath as the Grand Chancellor questioned him. The Emperor did not answer the Prime Minister's question. Instead, he said coldly, "Prime Minister, I happen to have an idea. I'd like to hear your opinion." "Your Majesty, please speak." Salambanili felt the coldness in the Emperor's voice and immediately calmed down. "I want to depose the Empress." "What?" the old man suddenly exclaimed, almost stumbling to the ground. "I said, I want to depose the Empress and set up." Garcia looked coldly at the Prime Minister, who had turned pale with fright. "Absolutely not!" the old Prime Minister almost exclaimed. The old man clenched his hands and suddenly knelt down at the bottom of the step. He then raised his head high and stared at the Emperor. "Your Majesty! You absolutely cannot do this!" Garcia pursed his lips tightly and looked coldly at the old Prime Minister, who was kneeling in front of him. There was a haze in his eyes. "The Empress comes from a noble family and is virtuous. Your Majesty, why do you—" The old Prime Minister broke out in cold sweat and was about to argue. "The Empress has no children. This is the biggest sin," Garcia said coldly. "Married for several years, no children. Just based on this, it is also in accordance with no." The old Prime Minister did not wait for the Emperor to finish this time and firmly interrupted him. On his aged face, the look in his eyes was surprisingly tough. "No children?" Salambanili was so angry that he almost vomited blood. How could the crime of having no children be blamed on that woman? The whole imperial city knew about this emperor's hobby. After being married for several years, he only liked men and did not like women. Under such circumstances, if the empress could give birth to a child, it would be a miracle. Everyone in the imperial city knew about this. Now, you want to use the crime of no children to abolish the Minas family's daughter? O Emperor! Do you want to completely anger the Minas family? If you really do this, not only will you completely anger the Minas family, you will also become the laughing stock of the imperial city. If the Minas family's daughter is abolished like this, it will be a great humiliation for the Minas family. The Duke of Minas had spent his whole life in the military and had countless disciples and subordinates. If he completely angered the Minas family, and at a time when the emperor's power was unstable, is the emperor's brain damaged? Why not? The emperor looked coldly at the prime minister. "I am the emperor of the empire, the ruler of the country. Do I have to look at other people's faces when I abolish a woman? Yes, Your Majesty, you have to look at other people's faces now. The Prime Minister was obviously going all out today. He raised his head and looked into the Emperor's eyes. He gritted his teeth and said coldly, if it was in the past, when the Emperor's power was stable, the Emperor could do whatever he wanted with more than 10 divisions and hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Central Army. But Your Majesty, with the current situation, do you still need me to explain it to you? Garcia was a little surprised by the Prime Minister's toughness today. Please forgive this old subject's nonsense. But today, even if Your Majesty wants to punish me, I still have to say it, Your Majesty. You can't afford to offend the Minas family now. You can't afford to offend the military. The muscles on Garcia's face twitched, the corners of his eyes twitched, and his breathing quickened. After a long time, he finally sat down slowly and took a deep breath. The Empress hates me. The Empress hates you, but the Minas family doesn't. The Prime Minister shook his head. I tried to kill the Empress several times. Garcia sighed and told his secret. The Empress must be holding a grudge. Under such circumstances, how could I dare to use her father and brother? The Prime Minister was stunned. He knew that the Emperor and his wife were not on good terms, but he did not expect that the Emperor had tried to kill the Empress. A life-and-death feud was a different story. The Prime Minister's mind spun quickly. He thought for a while and said in a low voice, the Duke of Minas is magnanimous, and his loyalty to the Empire is unquestionable. Besides, the Duke is a man of great achievements, I don't think. Looking at the Emperor's indifference, the Prime Minister sighed in his heart. This young Emperor looked smart, but after all, he was not broad-minded enough. He was too narrow-minded. The Prime Minister pondered for a while and said slowly, Your Majesty, in the eyes of a politician, there is no personal grudge. To achieve great things, one has to forget many small things. The Duke of Minas has been in politics for a long time. He understands this principle. Garcia's eyes were conflicted, and his face was a little pale. You? Let me think again. Let's think about it again. The Prime Minister sighed and stood up. The Prime Minister's mind spun. He was afraid that he had to think of a solution for this matter. The Emperor and the Empress had such a big grudge. Since the Emperor was not broad-minded enough, he had to start with the Duke of Minas. The Duke had been in politics for a long time. What had he not seen? What did he not understand? In the eyes of a real politician, this kind of personal grudge was not an insurmountable threshold. To achieve great things, one must know how to sacrifice and tolerate. This young Emperor is really too lacking. Thinking of this, the Prime Minister sighed and was about to leave. The Emperor did not speak, but just waved his hand. But when the Prime Minister reached the door, he suddenly stopped and turned around. The old man's face was full of despair. Your Majesty, even if you blame me or kill me today, I still have to say a few words. The Prime Minister took a deep breath and slowly said, Use the Minas family, you have no other choice. The Empire's army cannot be controlled by one person. In the end, the founding Emperor of the Empire could not tolerate the Duke of the Tulip family's dominance. And, Your Majesty, forgive this old minister's sin. In this old minister's opinion, Your Majesty is not as good as His Majesty the founding Emperor. And Adric, I am afraid, is not the Duke of the Tulip family. If Your Majesty is willing to be a mere figurehead for the next few decades, then take it as if this old minister did not say anything today. If Your Majesty has the heart to do something, then the Minas family is your only choice. After saying that, the old man strode out without hesitation. As he walked out of the hall, a gust of wind blew. The Prime Minister suddenly felt cold, and could not help but shiver a few times. It was clearly noon, the sun was shining brightly and the wind was warm, but the Prime Minister felt as if he was in an ice cellar. riddled with holes, riddled with holes. The Prime Minister's mouth was bitter. Even if he wanted to be a famous Prime Minister, this young Emperor was not an easy one to serve. Because of a personal grudge with the Empress, he actually tried to assassinate his own wife, not to mention the powerful family behind the Empress. The dignified Emperor of the Empire actually did such a brainless thing. What a good-for-nothing! He hurriedly ran out of the palace. Outside the palace, his family's carriage and guards were waiting. The old Prime Minister was so worried that when he got into the carriage, he staggered and almost fell. Fortunately, the guards were agile and supported the old man. Go directly to the Duke of Minas's residence. Quick! The Prime Minister had just said this when his heart suddenly moved and he changed his words. No! Go back to the residence. Send someone to the Duke of Minas's residence and deliver my invitation. Say that it's my birthday tonight and I invite the Duke to a banquet. The steward next to the carriage was stunned and could not help but say, Master, your birthday is next month. Shut up. The Prime Minister suddenly flew into a rage and scolded the old steward who had followed him for many years. If I tell you to go, then go. Don't talk too much. The carriage started to move. The Prime Minister sat in the carriage, exhausted. He rubbed his forehead hard. That old fox naturally knows that my birthday is not tonight. When I send the invitation, he will naturally understand my hint. This old thing deliberately pretends to hide his strength and bide his time, but in fact, he is very eager. Humph, he has long had the intention of reviving. When I invite him, he will naturally understand my hint and come to the banquet. Tonight, I have to lay my cards on the table with him. However, if the Minas family is really divided because of the Empress, then I have to be prepared. Sigh, the Emperor is young and indecisive. Does he not know that in order to do big things, one must be decisive and decisive? Politics is more dangerous than the battlefield. If the Minas family is really offended, then I have to make a decision. There is no room for mercy. Thinking of this, the Prime Minister's squinted eyes flashed. He gently opened the carriage window and summoned his guard captain. Pick a team of trusted people in the residence, the best in martial arts, outside the backyard tonight. After giving the order, the Prime Minister closed the carriage window with a cold expression. That old Minas. If he is going to do big things, then even if I have to risk my life, I will make the Emperor use him again. But if he shows any resentment tonight, then he cannot be left alive. The little Emperor is very extreme in small matters, but he is indecisive in big matters. He is not going to do great things. Since he has already offended someone, then he either has to think of a way to resolve the hatred, or be ruthless and get rid of the trouble in the future. When it came to political matters, how could one be so hesitant? Stupid. Salem Bonili's thoughts had never been as complicated as they were today. According to his original intention, he naturally hoped that the Emperor could use the Minas family again to divide the military forces, stabilize the situation with a balanced approach, and fight for more space for the Emperor's power. The Empire was in such a state of decline. As the Prime Minister, he was chosen by the late Emperor to entrust his children to him. He was also entrusted with an important task by Kasia. Naturally, he had to tread on thin ice. Ever since he officially came to power, there wasn't a day when he didn't put his heart and soul into planning everything for the Empire. As the Prime Minister of the Empire, almost all the heavy responsibilities, both internal and external, were placed on his shoulders. Salem Bonili had always believed that if the Empire wanted to restore its former glory, there must be a strong centralization of power. Consolidating the Emperor's power was the most important thing he had to plan for the little Emperor. Only when there was a strong and wise Emperor, who had the power to sweep away all obstacles and firmly hold the lifeline of the Empire in his hands, could he boldly and decisively carry out the various changes he had in mind for the Empire. Only when he had the power, he would not be restrained or opposed by others. Even though the old Prime Minister had already seen clearly that Emperor Kejia wasn't the type to be a wise and powerful emperor, he didn't think that Emperor Kejia was the type to be a wise and powerful emperor. Relying on the Minas family to divide the forces of Adrik in the military, so that one family in the military would become two families fighting for supremacy. Then, the emperor would have the leeway to exercise the balance, or mediate the conflict between the two families, or instigate the two families to fight. This was the way of the emperor. Controlling the movements of the military in his hands, then he could reorganize the military and conquer all sides. The Minas family was an important chess piece for Salem Bonili's political ideals in advance. If the Minas family could not be used, then the military would really become the dominant force. Although Salem Bonili was confident that General Auderic was a loyal and upright person and would not have any thoughts of rebelling against the emperor, Salem Bonili was confident that General Auderic would be loyal and upright. But the most unreliable thing in the world was the human heart. Adrik was loyal now, but it did not mean that he would be so loyal forever. If a person sat in a high position for a long time, it was inevitable that he would change. Moreover, even if Adrik himself did not change, he naturally had a group of proud soldiers and brave generals in the military, and it was hard to guarantee that no one would have any thoughts of rebellion. When the authority of the royal family declined to such a state, it would often attract the covetous eyes of some ambitious people. If any of the generals in the military had the intention of following the emperor, and urged Adrik to rebel, even if Adrik was really loyal with his character, he would definitely cause conflicts with the emperor. At that time, once there was an irreconcilable conflict, with Adrik's power and prestige in the military, if the emperor wanted to lay hands on him, at that time, it would be a big disaster. Monopolizing the power of one family was a recipe for disaster. Minas. Hopefully, the old duke was a real politician who knew how to adapt to circumstances. Deep in the old prime minister's heart, he really did not want to do anything to the Minas family. That was the last step that he would take at the last moment when he had no other choice. It must be known that the Minas family was a centipede that would not fall over even if it was dead. If he were to eliminate the Minas family, it would definitely attract the anger and hatred of the old duke's subordinates in the military. However, if things really went to the point that he did not want to see the most, he would have no choice but to do it. The danger of a Minas family that hated the royal family was too dangerous. After waiting in the mansion for a long time, a steward finally came back to report that the Prime Minister's invitation had been delivered. Duke Minas had accepted the invitation and promised to attend the banquet tonight to celebrate the Prime Minister's birthday. Salem Bonili was slightly relieved. Good, this old man really had the intention of reviving. Although he was pretending to be calm now, in fact, this old man was very eager in his heart. Humph, I'm not afraid of your ambition, but I'm afraid of your heart being as calm as still water. Since the old duke still had an eager heart, there was more room for negotiation tonight. The old prime minister had made all the preparations at home, and even prepared a team of elite warriors from his own private army. These elite warriors were raised by noble families and were only loyal to the family, so they were the most reliable. By evening, he had already sent people to wait at the entrance of the mansion, but after waiting for a long time, the old duke's convoy did not arrive. Salem Bonili was, after all, a little guilty. He had prepared such a murderous meeting tonight. After all, he had a guilty conscience. He was a little paranoid. Could it be that the old duke had noticed him? Impossible. The men he had prepared were all the elite warriors of his own family. The news would never leak out. The old prime minister finally could not hold back and sent two capable and trusted stewards to the duke's mansion to inquire about the news. When the sun gradually set, the men ran back to report the news. "Master, when we arrived at the Duke's mansion, we heard that the old Duke was about to go out and come here. However, before he left, he suddenly returned to the mansion as if he had something urgent to attend to. After that, young Lord Rhodey suddenly rushed out of the mansion with 100 elite bodyguards and knights. They rushed towards the direction of the triumphal arch like a gust of wind. We have inquired and heard that young Lord Rhodey had already led his men out of the city gate. The entire Duke's mansion is on high alert as if they are facing a great enemy. The old Duke even ordered his men to disperse the carriages outside the Duke's mansion." When the old Prime Minister heard this, he was puzzled. What is going on? What happened in the Duke of Minas's mansion? To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 539. GOR Chapter 496. Late Night Visit. Salem Bonilla was feeling uneasy, but he had no better idea. He could only send his best men to the Duke of Minas's mansion to gather information. Time passed little by little. The old Prime Minister had never felt so nervous before. Even when Osgilla was breached and the rebels entered the city, the old man had never felt so nervous. Although the situation at the time was dire and they were in dire straits, the old Prime Minister's thoughts were very simple. If the country was destroyed, then as the Prime Minister, he would just die to preserve his reputation. But tonight's situation was different. His uneasiness was mostly due to his guilty conscience. Although he trusted the elite warriors raised by his family very much. After all, in the Empire, every noble family had the tradition of raising elite private soldiers. The private soldiers raised by these families were equal to the private army of the noble families. Their fate and honor had been completely connected with their families. Their loyalty to their families was unquestionable. There was almost no possibility of rebellion. But the nobles would not tolerate rebellious behavior. Once such a situation occurred, the traitor would be spurned by the entire noble class. Today, he made preparations. His target was naturally the Duke of Minas. The Duke of Minas had decided to meet with him at the banquet. But before he left, he suddenly cancelled the meeting. Could it be that the shrewd old man had noticed his movements? Logically speaking, it was impossible. The elite warriors of his family would never betray him and tell on him. However, the old Prime Minister, who had spent his entire life in the bureaucracy, knew that nothing was absolute in this world. Oftentimes, it was those seemingly impossible things that once happened, it would bring about a calamity of annihilation. With the deep background of the Duke of Minas's family in the military, if the old Duke were to find out that the old Prime Minister intended to kill him, then the retaliation from the Minas family would be. He gently shook his head. The old Prime Minister tried his best to suppress the distracting thoughts in his mind. No way. If he had sensed it, he would have already launched a counterattack. The old Duke of Minas had been keeping a low profile for the past few years, acting like an old man standing aloof from worldly affairs. However, Salem Bonilla was also an old man. He had personally experienced the period when the old Duke of Minas was in charge of the army. Back then, the Duke of Minas was resolute. He was decisive and never hesitated. If the old Duke knew that he had the intention to harm him, he would have already sent the elite troops of the Duke of Minas to fight him. The old Duke had spent his entire life in the military, and the elite warriors he raised in his household were undoubtedly the best among all the noble families in the Empire in terms of both quantity and quality. The only thing that could match the quality of the Minas family's private army was probably the Emperor's private army, the Dark Knight Imperial Guards. If the Duke of Minas was determined to counterattack, then he would be the one to lose if they fought. This was a moment of life and death, The old Prime Minister did not think that his thoughts were too exaggerated at all. He knew the Duke of Minas too well. This guy seemed to be very amiable these past few years, but his temperament would never change. As the Prime Minister and the Emperor's most trusted aide, if the old Duke knew that he was going to attack him, then he would definitely interpret it as the Emperor's intention. Once he believed that the Emperor wanted to attack the Minas family, then the Minas family would no longer have any misgivings about their counterattack. May the gods bless us. The old Prime Minister's face was cold, and his eyes were full of coldness. If the Minas family is loyal to the imperial family, then it will be a great fortune for the empire. If it really becomes a mess, then it will be a great disaster for the empire. When the sky was completely dark, the old Prime Minister did not even take a bite of his dinner. He waited quietly in the study. Finally, when it was almost midnight, the person who had been sent out to gather information finally came back with a report. The person who had been sent out was the Prime Minister's personal bodyguard. He was a capable middle-aged warrior. When he ran into the Prime Minister's study, his forehead was sweating and he was gasping for breath. It was obvious that he had been running around tirelessly. "Your Excellency, there is news." The bodyguard was about to kneel down and salute when the Prime Minister frowned and said, "Speak. What time is it now? There is no need to salute. Speak quickly." "Yes, Your Excellency." The guard captain was a cautious and meticulous person. He took a deep breath and quickly whispered, "I've divided my men into two groups. One group will go to the city gate to investigate, while the other group will follow me to hide near the Duke's mansion. Just a while ago, we finally received news that the knight Rhodey led had returned from outside the city. At night, the city gates were closed for curfew. It was Rhodey who showed the Duke's letter and allowed the guards to open the gates and let them in. My men were nearby at the time and saw everything clearly. There is no mistake." After a pause, the guard captain added, "There is an unusual detail. I heard that when Lord Rhodey brought his men out of the city, they were all riding horses. When they returned, there was an additional light carriage. The carriage was very simple and crude. Apparently, it was temporarily acquired outside the city. Some of my men recognized that it was a wagon. However, it was temporarily modified and a shed was added to the carriage. When they entered the city, the cavalrymen surrounded the carriage in the middle. The shed was lowered and tightly covered. It was obvious that they did not want people to see what was inside. Because they had the Duke's letter, the guards did not dare to question them and let them enter the city. After that, the group of people went straight back to the Duke's mansion. What else? The Prime Minister nodded. The bodyguard pondered for a moment and said, "I saw the carriage outside the Duke's mansion. From the tire marks, the carriage did not carry much weight. The tire marks on the road were light and shallow." "Very good. You are very careful." The Prime Minister nodded again. He then frowned and asked, "What do you think is hidden in the carriage?" This subordinate does not know. I also do not dare to make wild guesses. The bodyguard shook his head honestly. After the carriage entered the mansion, the Duke's mansion closed the gate. It can be seen that the mansion is heavily guarded. The number of guards has at least doubled. Salem Bonili took a deep breath and paced around the room for a while. He then quickly went to the table and wrote a warrant. He gave it to the bodyguard and said, "The city is now under curfew. Take this warrant and go out of the city to investigate. Where did Rhodey and his men go when they left the city? Who did they meet? Also, where did the carriage come from? Investigate everything." At this point, the Prime Minister hesitated for a moment. The guard captain thought of something and said in a low voice, "Your Excellency, shouldn't we do it cleanly? Should we investigate all the relevant people?" As he spoke, he made a cutting motion with one hand. "There is no need." The Prime Minister suddenly smiled. The haze and nervousness in his eyes had disappeared. "The situation does not seem to be as bad as I thought. Investigate carefully. Do not leave any traces. Do not let anyone know that you are from my mansion. Didn't the military transfer a lot of garrison troops from the south? Change into the garrison's uniform and go out of the city to find out more information. After the bodyguard left, the Prime Minister let out a long sigh of relief and slowly sat back in his chair. It seems that the Minas family's strange movements were not because they had discovered my movements. It was because they had something important to do at home. What was in the carriage that Rhodey brought back? What could be stored in a small carriage? Prohibited items? Of course not. Prohibited items were usually military equipment. However, the Duke of Minas had held a high position in the military for half of his life. Prohibited weapons and equipment might be rare to others, but he must have a lot of them in his mansion. Then, could it be private goods? The Duke of Minas did not lack money, and would not do such a thing. Could it be people? Or the old Duke had contacted some of his old subordinates in the south and asked them to come to the city to discuss some secret matters. Thinking of this, the old Prime Minister suddenly smiled bitterly. It was not right to think that way. Unless it was to gather his old subordinates for a rebellion, the old Duke would not summon his old subordinates now. He had been keeping a low profile for so many years. He would not summon his old subordinates right before he was about to rise again. It would arouse suspicion. He should be even more low-key now. Thinking of this, the Prime Minister's heart stirred as he recalled something. Counting the days, it should not be time yet. A large group of people came from the north. Even if they traveled fast, it should still be half a month before they arrive. When it was almost dawn, the bodyguard captain came back with the results of his investigation. The bodyguard captain was very efficient and the information he gathered was very detailed. When young Duke Rhodey left the city, he brought some people to a small village in the northwest. It is less than 20 miles away from the imperial capital. I brought some people to ask around in the village. The carriage was also bought from a carriage shop in the village. We asked the people at the carriage shop. At that time, the young Duke brought some people to surround the carriage shop and did not allow anyone to enter. However, the people at the carriage shop heard the sound of crying from a distance. Even young Duke Rhodey's eyes were red when he came out. However, he looked very excited as if he was very happy. I understand. The Prime Minister's reaction was a lot calmer this time. It was obvious that the news he brought back had further confirmed his guess. Master, you are dismissed. Let everyone rest. Nothing major will happen. The Prime Minister let out a long sigh. There was a complicated look in his eyes. What happened next is not something you can understand. After the head of the imperial bodyguards left, the old Prime Minister called his personal steward over. Prepare the carriage. I want to go out. The housekeeper looked at the Prime Minister's tired face and could not help but say, Master, you have not eaten anything tonight. It is getting late, what do you know? Whether my great matter succeeds or not will depend on tonight. Go quickly. Do not let the bodyguards follow you. Change into an inconspicuous old carriage. I want to go to the military headquarters. The old Prime Minister stealthily left the estate in the middle of the night in a light carriage, accompanied by only 2 personal attendants. Even the coachman was the steward of the estate. The Prime Minister did not show up when he visited the imperial military headquarters in the middle of the night. He only asked his subordinates to show the highest level pass, and the guards immediately let him in. The person Salem Bonilla wanted to visit was Adric. Although it was already midnight, the Prime Minister did not doubt that Adric was not asleep yet. Although the old Prime Minister knew that his political goal was to restrain this overly powerful military chief, the old Prime Minister knew that his political goal was to restrain him. But in private, he also admired this current pillar of the Empire's military. Adric was selfless. Since he became the military minister, he had been so busy with official business that he forgot to eat and sleep. It could be said that he was the most diligent military minister the Empire had seen in 100 years. Even though they were on different sides, the old Prime Minister still admired Aderic's diligence in governance. Audric was surprised by the Prime Minister's late-night visit, but he immediately realized that the Prime Minister must have something important to discuss with him. That was why he had chosen to come at such a time. Audric met the Prime Minister without batting an eyelid and ordered his bodyguards to strictly guard the room where they were meeting. After personally closing the door, Audric turned around and looked at the Prime Minister, who was already sitting leisurely in a chair. "Your Excellency, for you to come so late at night, I wonder." Before Audric could finish, the Prime Minister had already let out a long sigh. "General Audric, you are so busy with the Empire's military affairs that you forget to eat and sleep. I really admire you." As he spoke, the Prime Minister's eyes deliberately fell on Audric's table. There was a plate of food on which was obviously Audric's dinner. There were 2 cold and hard flatbread with only a piece of bacon sandwiched in between. Because it was already cold, there was a layer of disgusting white oil floating on it. The dignified military minister of the Empire, the number 1 figure in the Empire's military, was actually eating so crudely. The Prime Minister could naturally see that the flatbread was made from the most common coarse grain. As for the bacon, it was no different from what ordinary soldiers ate. Audric saw the Prime Minister's eyes and smiled faintly. "Prime Minister, you are exaggerating. This kind of meal is already not bad. At least there is meat to eat. If it was a military meal, having flatbread to satisfy one's hunger would already be considered very good." The old man nodded, a complicated look in his eyes. He let out a long sigh and looked at Audric's tired face. In a low voice, he asked, "General, how many days have you not slept?" Audric frowned slightly. "Prime Minister, for you to visit so late at night, I'm afraid you aren't here to discuss food and lodging with me, right?" In fact, Audric hadn't slept for 2 days. Now that he was mentally exhausted, he was somewhat impatient. "General, you have worked hard," the Prime Minister said faintly. "However, I have something to ask you. What do you think is the most difficult thing for you right now?" To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.